Section 1. Welcome to the town that makes no sense. Go ahead and get comfortable. Settle in. Pull whatever blanket you've got a little closer, dim the screen down as far as you need to, and let the room around you get quiet. Because tonight, we are not rushing anywhere. There is nowhere to be and nothing urgent waiting for you. What we are doing tonight is something a little different. We are going to spend the next several hours wandering through the strange, contradictory, wonderfully ridiculous world of a show that has been on television since 1999. A show that most of us grew up watching, quoting, and arguing about. And a show that, despite its decades on air, has somehow managed to leave an almost impossible number of questions completely unanswered. That show, of course, is Family Guy. Now, right away, I want you to understand what kind of journey this is going to be. This is not a fast-paced, high-energy breakdown. This is not a countdown list. This is a long, slow, thorough walk through the lore, the mysteries, the contradictions, and the genuinely baffling corners of this show's fictional universe. We are going to take our time with every single one of these topics. We are going to sit with them. We are going to explore them from every angle. And if at any point you feel yourself drifting off, that is completely fine. That is actually the whole point. This script is designed to be the kind of thing you put on in the dark, something long enough and calm enough and interesting enough that it carries you all the way from awake to asleep without you even noticing the transition. So let us begin at the very beginning, which in this case means the town itself. The show is set in a fictional city in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island is famously the smallest state in the United States. It covers about 1,214 square miles in total, which makes it roughly the size of a modest county in a larger state. And yet, the town at the center of Family Guy manages to feel enormous. Over 25 seasons, it has been depicted as having a downtown district, a waterfront, a harbor, suburbs, industrial areas, a brewery, a television news station, a giant courthouse, multiple hospitals, several schools ranging from preschool all the way through a university, and enough restaurants, bars, and businesses to fill a mid-sized American city. The question of exactly how large this town is supposed to be has never been answered. It changes depending on what the episode needs it to be. In some episodes, the town feels genuinely small. Characters run into each other constantly at the grocery store, at the bar, at the diner. Everyone seems to know everyone else. The Griffin family and their circle of neighbors appear to represent a real community where people's lives are genuinely intertwined. In other episodes, the same town swells to accommodate whatever the story needs. Suddenly, there are neighborhoods the Griffins have never seen. There are entire districts that appear for one episode and are never mentioned again. There are landmarks that show up with no explanation and vanish just as quickly. The geography shifts, the population seems to fluctuate wildly, and the overall sense of place is genuinely inconsistent from one season to the next. What is interesting about this is that the inconsistency is not random. It follows a kind of loose logic. The town gets bigger when the episode is about the town itself and the broader community. It gets smaller and more intimate when the episode is about the Griffin family specifically. It is as though the place is capable of adjusting its own size to fit the emotional or comedic needs of any given story. Which is a delightful idea if you think about it. A town that breathes in and out depending on what the story requires. The town also has a complicated relationship with real-world geography. Rhode Island is a real place, and Family Guy has leaned into that real-world setting more than most animated shows do. The state of Rhode Island, its landmarks, its culture, and its sports loyalties all play a role in the show. The Griffin family roots for the New England Patriots in football, which is consistent with where they live. Characters reference real Rhode Island geography, mention real cities nearby, and generally inhabit a version of New England that feels grounded in something genuine. And yet the town itself, despite all of that real-world context, functions by rules that no actual town could follow. Businesses close and reopen without explanation. Buildings are destroyed in one episode and completely intact in the next. The bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their free time, a place called the Drunken Clam, has been demolished, burned down, flooded, and rebuilt so many times that it has essentially become its own supernatural entity. The same applies to the Griffin House. The family's home at 31 Spooner Street has been totaled, renovated, destroyed by various disasters, and completely repaired, episode after episode, with no in-universe explanation for how a working-class family keeps affording the rebuilding costs. In the real world, one house fire would set a family like the Griffins back years. In this universe, the house is simply ready again by the following week. The neighborhood itself is equally malleable. The houses of the neighbors are clearly arranged in a particular configuration. Joe Swanson lives directly next door on one side. Cleveland Brown, before he left for his own spin-off show, lived across the street. Quagmire lives nearby enough that he is always conveniently present for group scenes. And yet the actual spatial relationship between these properties has never been completely consistent. Distances shift. Sightlines change. A character can shout from one house and be heard clearly in another in one episode, and in a different episode, those same houses seem to be separated by a much larger gap. None of this is a criticism. It is simply an observation about the kind of world Family Guy occupies. It is a world that runs on a different kind of logic than realism demands. The town exists not as a mapped, fixed place, but as a flexible backdrop that arranges itself around the comedy and the story. This is actually part of what makes the show feel the way it does. There is a dreamlike quality to the geography, a sense that the familiar surroundings can shift and rearrange when you are not looking directly at them, which, when you are falling asleep, is actually a rather comfortable sensation to sit inside. The idea that the world around you is loose and soft, that the rules are bendable, that nothing is entirely fixed ad ad. That looseness extends to the show's relationship with time, which is another enormous source of unanswered questions. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. At that point, the Griffin children were specific ages. Meg was in high school and roughly 16 or 17 years old. Chris was in middle school, probably 13 or 14. And Stewie was an infant, officially listed as approximately 1 year old. Over the next 25 years of the show's run, those ages have drifted, shifted, and fluctuated in ways that do not add up to any coherent timeline. The show officially uses what is sometimes called a floating timeline, which means the characters do not age at a consistent real-world rate. They exist in a sort of perpetual present, always roughly the same age they started, even as the world around them updates to reflect current technology, current pop culture, and current events. This creates situations that are genuinely impossible to reconcile if you try to map them against each other. Peter Griffin has been stated to be in his 40s at various points, but the actual number shifts depending on the episode. At one point, he is said to be 42, at another, 45. In a future set sequence, he claims to be 58. The writers have acknowledged openly that his age is intentionally vague and changes based on what any given story needs. The same is true for Lois, and the kids, and essentially every character on the show. What makes this particularly interesting from a lore perspective is that the show occasionally commits to a specific age and then contradicts it later. Meg is confirmed to turn 17 in the 5th season episode called Peter's Two Dads, which would put her birth date in a range that more or less makes sense for the show's early years. But then in later seasons, she is still in high school, still acting like a teenager, still having the kinds of experiences a 17-year-old would have, despite the show having moved through nearly 2 more decades of airtime. The math simply does not work, not even close, and the show knows it. There are meta jokes scattered throughout later seasons where characters directly acknowledge that the timeline makes no sense, which is charming in its own way but does nothing to actually resolve the question. The weather's also puzzling. Rhode Island has genuine seasons. Winters in New England are cold, genuinely cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and keeps people inside. Summers are warm and humid. Spring and fall are brief and beautiful. The show depicts all of these seasons at various points, and holiday episodes exist across the calendar year. But the sequence of those seasons does not always follow. Episodes set in summer can air directly after episodes that clearly took place in deep winter, with no acknowledgement of the months that should have passed between them. The show moves through time the way dreams do, which is to say, not in a straight line. And that quality, that dreamlike looseness where time and space are always slightly soft around the edges, is something worth holding on to as we move deeper into the show's mysteries. Because the town is just the container. The real questions, the ones that have kept fans theorizing and debating for decades, are about the people inside it, about who they are, where they came from, and what they are actually doing in a universe where the rules are whatever the episode needs them to be. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. Whether you are in your bedroom at midnight, on your couch at 3 in the morning, watching from across the ocean, or anywhere else entirely, I want to know. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. It is free, it helps more than you know, and it means you will be here for every single one of these long, slow, late-night deep dives we do together. Section 2. Peter Griffin and the Impossible Life. Let us start with the man himself, the center of everything. The reason the show exists and the reason it has continued to exist for longer than some of its viewers have been alive. Peter Griffin. Father, husband, brewery worker, occasional menace, and human being whose entire personal history contains enough contradictions to fill a research thesis. Peter Griffin was born under circumstances that the show has revealed gradually and not always consistently over its run. His full name, as established in the episode Quagmire's Mom, is Justin Peter Griffin. The middle name Lowenbrow was used in a single early episode at a society gathering, and then quietly abandoned, presumably because the writers decided it was too specific a joke to maintain long-term. So officially, he is Justin Peter Griffin, though essentially everyone in the show calls him Peter and nothing else. His birthplace has been the subject of one of the show's most memorable revelations. In the episode Padre de Familia, it is revealed that Peter was actually born in Mexico. His mother, Thelma, had traveled there while pregnant, and Peter was born on Mexican soil, technically making him a Mexican-born citizen rather than an American one. This was presented as a significant plot point, since it meant Peter was not legally a citizen of the United States and had to go through the process of becoming one. His wealthy father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, eventually used his connections to arrange for Peter's citizenship in exchange for Peter abandoning an uprising he had started among Carter's servants. That is a remarkable amount of biographical detail for a show that generally resists committing to any single version of its characters' histories. And the detail creates immediate questions. If Peter was born in Mexico, what were the circumstances of Thelma's trip? Why was she there? The show does not explain this. Thelma Griffin, Peter's mother, is a complex character in her own right, having been revealed over multiple episodes to have had a richer and more complicated past than her son's adventures generally acknowledge. But the Mexican birth, despite being stated as a matter of canon fact in the episode, is one of those details that the show never fully integrates. It is mentioned, it drives a plot, and then it more or less sits there without the wider implications being explored. Peter's biological parentage is another area where the show has committed to a revelation that raises more questions than it answers. For most of the show's run, Peter was understood to have been raised by Francis Griffin, a strict, religious Irish American man who served as a challenging but ultimately present father figure. Francis died in the seventh season episode Peter's Two Dads in a genuinely emotional moment that the show handled with unexpected care. But that same episode also contains the revelation that Francis was not actually Peter's biological father. The truth, as established in that episode, is that Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman whom Thelma had a relationship with before settling down with Francis. Peter travels to Ireland to find Mickey, discovers that he is a real person with a real life and real personality, and the two of them form a tentative connection. Mickey is depicted as charming, irresponsible, and more than a little reckless, which tracks with certain aspects of Peter's own personality. The suggestion being that Peter inherited some of his more chaotic tendencies from a man he never grew up knowing. This is actually a remarkably developed piece of backstory for a character who is often played as a broad comedic figure. The idea that Peter's relationship with his non-biological father shaped who he became, while the biological father he never knew contributed something to his genetic makeup, is the kind of nuanced character work that the show is capable of when it chooses to commit to it. And yet the revelation of Mickey McFinnigan, like so many details in Family Guy's lore, does not really change anything going forward. Mickey appears, the story resolves, and Peter more or less returns to being the same person he was before. The biological father question is answered but not explored. The door is opened and immediately closed again. Peter's childhood is sketched in through flashbacks scattered across many episodes, and these flashbacks collectively paint a picture that does not always hold together. He grew up in the New England area, apparently. He attended school, though his academic history is vague. He had friends, though the specifics vary. He worked various jobs before ending up at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory, where he was employed as a safety inspector, a job that strains credulity given Peter's intellectual limitations, but which the show simply accepts as a given. He later transitions to working at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which becomes his long-term place of employment and the setting for numerous storylines involving workplace dynamics. What the flashbacks collectively reveal is a childhood marked by insecurity, a complicated relationship with a father who is demanding and sometimes cold, and a personality that was always fundamentally the same. Peter as a child in these flashbacks is recognizable as Peter the adult. He is bumbling, enthusiastic, easily distracted, and possessed of a warmth underneath all the chaos that makes him sympathetic even when he is at his worst. But the specifics of how he became the man we see on screen, the exact sequence of events that brought him from a child in New England to a father in a specific house on a specific street, with a specific job and a specific group of friends, are never laid out in any complete or coherent way. His relationship with his wife Lois is equally rich in unexplored territory. The show has established that Peter and Lois met while she was in college, and he was working as a janitor at the same institution. Lois comes from an extraordinarily wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, and her decision to marry Peter was, from the perspective of her father Carter, essentially a catastrophe. Carter Pewterschmidt has never fully accepted Peter and makes no secret of his disdain for his son-in-law across nearly every season of the show. The tension between Carter's enormous wealth and Peter's working-class existence is a recurring source of comedy, but it also raises genuine questions about how Lois and Peter ended up together and why. The show has never given a fully satisfying answer to this. There are episodes that explore the early stages of their relationship that show Peter pursuing Lois with a combination of earnest enthusiasm and spectacular incompetence, and that depict Lois being won over by something in him that her privileged upbringing had never provided. But the exact nature of what Lois sees in Peter, the specific quality that makes her choose him over every other possibility available to a wealthy, educated, attractive woman, is something the show gestures toward rather than explicitly stating. Peter is in some ways a mystery to Lois as much as he is to the audience. And Lois, for her part, is often depicted as having her own complicated history, her own desires and frustrations that the show hints at, but rarely fully addresses. One of the most intriguing unexplored territories in Peter's biography is the existence of children we almost never hear about. The show has, at various points, mentioned that Peter had at least one other child before the three Griffin kids we follow. Peter Jr., a baby son, was referenced as having died after Peter shook him in an attempt to stop his crying. This is played as a dark joke, a reference to a terrible real-world tragedy, and it is never returned to in any depth. Peter also has a biological son through a sperm donation, a boy named Bertram, who becomes significant in the Stewie storyline in ways we will discuss later. And there's the matter of Meg's own parentage, which the show has complicated in ways that deserve their own extended examination. What Peter's impossible life really represents, when you step back and look at it as a whole, is the tension between a character who is simultaneously richly developed and completely inconsistent. The show has given Peter more backstory than almost any character on the actual show itself has access to. There are flashbacks, there are reveals, there are episodes that peel back layers of who he is and where he came from. And yet none of it adds up to a coherent whole. The contradictions are not accidental. They are built into the structure of a show that uses its characters as flexible instruments for comedy, rather than as people whose histories must be kept consistent. The result is a Peter Griffin who feels like he has lived an enormous life, a life full of incident and color, and genuine emotional weight, even though the specific details of that life shift and change depending on what the episode needs from him. He is like a story that is being told by someone who is making it up as they go, but who genuinely loves the character they are creating, and whose affection for him shows through even when the facts do not line up. There is something deeply human about that, actually. Most of us do not have perfectly consistent autobiographies. Memory is selective. The stories we tell about ourselves change depending on who we are talking to and what point we are trying to make. Peter Griffin, in his wild inconsistency, is perhaps more realistic than a character with a perfectly documented and internally coherent history would be. He is the way we remember ourselves, rather than the way we actually were. Peter's relationship with his own identity also shifts in ways that are worth noting quietly. He has been depicted as deeply American in his sensibility, proud of his New England roots, loyal to his local sports teams, attached to his neighborhood and his bar and his friends in a way that feels genuinely rooted. But he has also been depicted as someone who discovers entirely new aspects of himself from episode to episode. He finds out he is part Mexican. He finds out his real father is Irish. He discovers he has a vestigial twin brother, a tiny extra person literally embedded in his shoulder named Chip, who is present in his body but separate in personality. He learns that his family history goes back through centuries of ancestors, some noble and some terrible, in flashback sequences that show the Griffin bloodline stretching back through history in gloriously absurd detail. Each of these discoveries says something different about who Peter Griffin is, and none of them is ever fully reconciled with the others. He contains multitudes in the way that only a character who has been written by hundreds of different people over 25 years can contain multitudes. Section 3. Brian Griffin and the question that nobody can answer. Of all the mysteries in Family Guy, there is one that gets raised more often than any other. It is the one question that every new viewer eventually lands on, usually somewhere in the first few episodes. And it is the question that the show has spent 25 years actively refusing to answer. What is Brian Griffin? Not who, not where he came from, though we will get to that. Not why he is here, though that too. What? What is the creature that lives with the Griffins, walks on two legs, drives a Toyota Prius with the license plate BRI, I-D0G, drinks martinis at the kitchen counter, holds down a job occasionally, files taxes presumably, and has romantic relationships with human women? What is the nature of this thing? The surface answer is simple. Brian is a dog, a white Labrador retriever to be exact. He was born to two normal dogs named Biscuit and a dog whose name was apparently Coco, according to a reference in the 4th season. His mother gave him up at a young age so that he could have a better life away from the puppy mill in Houston, Texas, where he was born. He eventually made his way to Rhode Island, where he spent time as a homeless stray, washing car windshields for change before Peter Griffin felt sorry for him and took him home. Before Brian, the Griffins had a different talking dog named Todd, who died at the age of 15, so Brian is the family's second talking dog, which immediately raises the question of whether talking dogs are simply a thing that exists in this universe and nobody finds particularly remarkable. The answer to that seems to be yes, mostly. The show has established across its run that Brian is not the only animal with human-level intelligence and the ability to function in human society. There is Ernie the giant chicken, who we will discuss at length in a later section. There are bears in Cleveland's spin-off show who live normal human lives. There are various other animals across the Seth MacFarlane universe who have been given human traits without any explanation. The world of Family Guy is simply one where certain animals have crossed some kind of threshold and now exist in a liminal space between animal and human. But Brian is special even within that framework. He does not just exist alongside humans. He lives as one of them. He was 6 years old when the show started, which in dog years is somewhere in middle age for most breeds. By the time the show has gone on as long as it has, he should technically be a very old dog by biological standards. The show acknowledges this inconsistency occasionally, usually for jokes. Brian himself referenced it to cite his expected lifespan in an early episode, telling Peter that if he played his cards right, he had maybe 7 more years left in him. That line was delivered when Brian was said to be 7 years old, making it a joke about the brevity of a dog's life. But decades later, Brian is essentially unchanged, which feeds into the same floating timeline logic that keeps everyone else perpetually middle-aged. What Brian can do is its own category of mystery. He can speak with an advanced vocabulary, hold sophisticated conversations, read and comprehend complex texts, write fiction and nonfiction, drive a car, and form romantic attachments to human women. His voice, provided by Seth MacFarlane, using his own natural speaking voice rather than the character voice he uses for Peter and Stewie, is the voice of an educated, sardonic American man in his mid-30s to early 40s. He does not sound like a dog. He sounds like a person. And the show commits to this completely. Brian's humanity is never questioned or explained. It is simply accepted as the baseline condition of the character. And yet Brian also sometimes behaves like a dog. He has been shown to have an intense fear of the vacuum cleaner. He once ran excitedly into the kitchen when someone shook a bag of dog food. It has been established that he can only relieve himself on the Griffin family's front lawn, a deeply dog-specific biological limitation that he apparently has no control over. He has chased squirrels, He is engaged in tail-chasing behavior. There are involuntary dog behaviors that surface in him despite everything else he is. This creates a fascinating and genuinely philosophically interesting portrait of a character caught between two natures. Brian Griffin is not fully human and not fully dog. He is something in between, something that does not have a proper category. He has human desires and human insecurities and human intelligence, but he is housed in a biological form that still has animal instincts embedded in it. The vacuum cleaner fear is not something he chooses. The lawn behavior is not something he can override. His biological programming runs beneath his conscious mind in ways that emerge at unexpected moments, like someone who speaks a second language so fluently they think in it, but who occasionally dreams in their first. One theory that fans have developed over the years, and it is worth spending some time with, even though it is speculative, is that Brian may be the product of some kind of scientific experimentation. The idea gets its most compelling in-show support from a throwaway line in the episode New Kidney in Town, in which Dr. Hartman mentions that he once tried to clone a chicken and accidentally created a hostile, man-sized chicken that escaped from his lab. This is presented as a casual aside, barely registered, but when you pair it with the existence of Ernie the Giant Chicken and with the existence of Brian, and with the general atmosphere of a world where talking animals are more common than they should be, it starts to suggest that someone in this universe has been conducting experiments in human-animal hybridization for a very long time. The theory goes further. American Dad, the show that Seth MacFarlane created 4 years after Family Guy premiered, established as part of its own lore that the CIA has the technology to transfer human consciousness into animal bodies. Klaus, the fish who lives with the Smith family on American Dad, is explicitly revealed to be a human man whose brain was placed inside a fish by CIA scientists. If that technology exists in the broader MacFarlane animated universe, then it is at least possible that something similar happened to Brian. The idea would be that Brian was once a human, or has a human consciousness or partial human consciousness embedded in him through some kind of experimental procedure, and that this is the real explanation for his unusual nature. The show has never confirmed or denied this theory. It has never even engaged with it directly. Brian's nature is treated as a given, an unexplained constant that the show simply accepts and builds around. But the theory is compelling precisely because it makes the character more interesting rather than less. If Brian has a human consciousness trapped in an animal body, then his alcoholism takes on a different resonance. His romantic yearnings for Lois, which the show depicts as genuine and persistent rather than played purely for jokes, make more sense in context. His existential frustration, his sense that he should be something more than he is, his perpetual status as someone who functions just below the level of social acceptance. All of these qualities read differently if the interior of Brian Griffin is not a dog's mind dressed up in human behaviors, but an actual human mind that woke up one day inside a dog's body. His origin story, as told in the episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog from the first season, establishes that Peter found Brian as a stray on the street and took him home out of sympathy. Prior to that, Brian was homeless, washing car windshields for spare change. This image of a dog standing at intersections washing windshields for money is inherently absurd as a piece of visual comedy. But it also says something remarkable about Brian's situation. He was trying to survive using human economic systems. He was engaged in wage labor, however informal and degrading. He was participating in human society on human terms, even before anyone gave him a place to stay. He was not a stray in the way animals are typically strays, waiting to be taken in and domesticated. He was a participant in the economy of the town who simply had not yet found a permanent place in it. The Griffin family's previous dog, Todd, died the same day Peter found Brian. The implication being that there was a vacancy in the household that Brian filled. But the show has also offered a different version of this story, one in which Brian is seen in flashback footage as already being in the Griffin home as a puppy, which directly contradicts the story of Peter finding him as an adult stray. This is one of those continuity issues that the show never resolves. There are essentially two versions of how Brian joined the family, and both have been presented as true at different points. The show does not choose between them. It lets both exist, which means that the true story of how Brian came to live with the Griffins is genuinely unknown. What is known is that Brian has spent much of his adult life trying to be something the world does not quite allow him to be. He is a writer, or aspires to be. He has been working on a novel for most of the show's run, a project that he mentions with a mixture of pride and defensiveness that suggests he is not entirely confident in it. He attended Brown University and came within one class of graduating, failing to finish his degree and carrying the shame of that incomplete around with him as a kind of permanent scar. He wants to be taken seriously as an intellectual. He wants his opinions to matter. He wants his creative work to be valued. And the world keeps finding gentle ways to let him know that these desires are not quite going to be satisfied. This is actually an enormously sympathetic portrait of a certain kind of person. The person who is smart enough to know what they want to be, but has not quite found the path to becoming it. The person who has done enough reading and thinking to have real opinions, but whose life circumstances keep pulling them away from the places where those opinions would be heard and valued. Brian Griffin is, in this reading, the portrait of someone perpetually stuck at the threshold of the life they imagine for themselves, close enough to see it, but unable to quite step through the door. And the question of what he actually is, the biological and ontological question of his nature, loops back around to this. Because whether he is a dog who somehow became human, or a human consciousness placed inside a dog, or something else entirely that the show has never named, the experience of being Brian Griffin is the experience of existing in a category that does not quite fit. He is too human to be a dog. He is too dog to be human. He is too smart for the life available to him, and not quite smart enough to escape it. He drives a Prius and drinks martinis and writes bad novels and falls in love with women who do not stay. And he does all of this with the quiet dignity of a person who has accepted that the universe is not going to give them exactly what they deserve, but intends to keep showing up anyway. That is the unanswered question at the heart of Brian Griffin. Not where he came from, not what scientific accident or deliberate intervention produced him, but what it means to be the thing he is. And the show, to its credit, has never cheapened that question with a tidy explanation. Section 4. Stewie Griffin and the Genius Nobody Can Explain. Here is the thing about Stewie Griffin that the show established in its very first season and then spent the next 20 years slowly walking back without ever fully resolving. Stewie Griffin is a baby who, in the normal biological sense of that word, should not be able to do anything he does. He should not be able to speak. He should not be able to walk. He should not be able to build a working time machine, a functional ray gun, a mind control device, a multiverse traversal remote control, a cloning apparatus, or any of the dozens of other pieces of advanced technology that he has constructed in the bedroom that officially belongs to an infant child. He is Marcus, canonically approximately 1 year old. He has been 1 year old for 25 years. In the pilot episode, he is described as being around 1. In later seasons, the same age is referenced. The show has never let him actually grow up. And yet, within that year of biological life, he has accomplished things that the most advanced human scientists working with the full resources of civilization have never managed. The question that haunts this character is not just how he came to be this way. It is what the show actually believes about him on a metaphysical level. Because Stewie is not just a smart baby. He is a baby who was, in the earliest seasons, genuinely evil. His primary goal in life, established from the very first episode, was to kill his mother Lois and achieve world domination. These were not abstract desires. They were operational missions. He built specific weapons for the specific purpose of eliminating his mother. He drafted actual plans for world conquest. He maintained a whole laboratory's worth of equipment in his bedroom, while Lois believed he was just doing what babies do. The question of whether Lois and the other adult characters can actually hear and understand what Stewie says is one that the show has never cleanly resolved. Seth MacFarlane addressed it at Comic-Con in 2011, saying that the rule was broadly that everyone can basically understand him, but they ignore it or interpret it as cute baby sounds. At the same executive producer level, Rich Appel clarified in 2015 that within the family, Brian always understands Stewie, and sometimes Chris does. But Peter and Lois are generally supposed not to understand him, while the outside world is handled on a story-by-story basis depending on what creates the best comedy. This deliberately inconsistent rule creates a fascinating ambiguity. There are episodes where Stewie delivers an elaborate speech about his plans for world domination, and Lois immediately responds with something like, "How cute." While there are other episodes where she responds directly to something he said, apparently having understood it perfectly. The joke changes depending on what the episode needs. And both versions are canonical. What the inconsistency really opens up is the philosophical question of what Stewie's intelligence means. If the people around him genuinely cannot hear or understand him, then his genius is essentially private. It exists in a self-contained bubble. His plans never truly threaten Lois because she cannot even perceive them as threats. He is the most dangerous person in any room who simultaneously has zero power to act on that danger, because he cannot walk to the store without being put in a stroller. This is the genius of the original character concept. The comedy was not just that a baby was evil. It was that being evil is completely useless when you are a baby. All the intelligence in the world, all the weaponry, all the scheming, amounts to nothing when you cannot drive yourself anywhere, cannot handle your own finances, cannot communicate your intentions to the people you need to in order to carry out your plans. Stewie is simultaneously the most competent person in his world and one of the most powerless. He is trapped in a form that negates everything he is capable of. The show provided an explanation of sorts for Stewie's origin in the 9th season episode The Big Bang Theory. This episode reveals something remarkable. Stewie was involved in the creation of the universe itself. The plot unfolds when Bertram, Stewie's half-brother, through Peter's sperm donation, uses a time machine to travel back in time with the goal of erasing Stewie from existence. Bertram targets Leonardo da Vinci, whom the show reveals is a distant ancestor of Lois on her side of the family, believing that killing da Vinci will prevent Stewie from ever being born. The plan nearly works. In the course of trying to stop Bertram, Stewie travels further and further back in time and it eventually finds himself at the moment before the universe began. And in a moment that is both deeply absurd and surprisingly profound for a show that usually resists profundity, it is established that the Big Bang itself was caused by Stewie. He is, in the show's cosmology, the first cause, the origin point of everything. This revelation does not explain Stewie's intelligence. If anything, it deepens the mystery. If Stewie created the universe, then the universe was created by someone who contains the intelligence to do so, which suggests that Stewie's genius is not an accident of genetics or a product of experimental science. It is something fundamental, something pre-existing, something that existed before matter and energy and space and time were arranged into the form we recognize. Stewie's mind is older than everything around it. He is playing the long game of infant villainy in a universe that he himself put into motion. The British accent is its own unexplained detail. Neither Peter nor Lois is British. Nobody in the Griffin family has any established British heritage that would account for the accent linguistically. The writers have never provided an in-universe explanation for why a baby born to two American parents in Rhode Island speaks with the precise, clipped cadences of a refined English villain. Seth MacFarlane has described Stewie as an evil Rex Harrison, which is a creative reference point that tells you about the performance, but not about the character's actual relationship to England or its linguistic traditions. One fan theory worth considering is that the British accent is not an accent at all from Stewie's perspective. It is simply the voice of an intelligence that exists outside normal developmental categories. Babies do not learn language by inheriting their parents' accents naturally. They learn by being immersed in a linguistic environment. If Stewie's intelligence predates his birth, if it existed in some form before he was housed in his current body, then the voice he speaks with might be the voice of that prior intelligence rather than anything learned from the world around him. The British accent is the voice of something ancient dressed up in a onesie. His relationship with Rupert, his beloved stuffed bear, is another thread of unexplained depth. Stewie treats Rupert as a real person. He has deep, involved conversations with the bear. He expresses genuine emotional need in relation to Rupert's presence. He was devastated in an episode where Brian drunkenly destroyed the bear, and the depth of his grief was played with complete seriousness. Rupert is not a joke to Stewie. He is a companion, a confidant. Perhaps the one relationship in Stewie's life that is unconditionally accepting of everything he is, because Rupert, being a stuffed animal, cannot judge him or fail to understand him or react with horror to his plans. The question is what exactly Stewie believes Rupert to be. He seems to know on some level that Rupert is an inanimate object. He is, after all, possessed of the intelligence to understand basic ontology, but knowing and feeling are different things. And Stewie's emotional bond to Rupert reads less like delusion and more like a kind of conscious choice. He knows the bear does not respond. He chooses to have the relationship anyway, which is, in its way, one of the more emotionally sophisticated things anyone on the show does. He creates meaning in a relationship that cannot naturally generate it, and he sustains that meaning through sheer force of will. There is also the matter of what Stewie would do if he grew up. The show has occasionally visited future versions of Stewie through time travel and dream sequences, and these visits suggest a future that involves maturity, emotional complexity, and a complicated relationship with Brian that grows into something genuinely profound. In Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, the feature-length special, Stewie at 35 is shown as someone who has moved past the evil genius phase entirely and is trying to figure out who he is in a more ordinary human sense. The future Stewie has gone to college, has friends, has a career of sorts, and is navigating the same kinds of mundane existential questions that most people face in their 30s. What that future version of Stewie has lost is the extraordinary quality that makes him interesting at 1 year old. The genius is still present, but it has been domesticated. The threat has been neutralized. The weapons have been put away. And what is left is a reasonably functional, reasonably unhappy adult who still speaks with a British accent and still loves Brian, but who no longer dreams of domination or builds machines in his bedroom. Whether that future represents the natural arc of what Stewie would become, or whether it is merely one of many possible futures in a universe that has been shown to contain infinite parallel versions of everything, is a question the show never resolves. The time machine allows for infinite alternate histories. The multiverse allows for infinite variations on every character. Stewie's future is not fixed. It is a cloud of possibilities, any of which could crystallize depending on choices not yet made. And that is perhaps the most fitting metaphor for Stewie as a character. He exists in a cloud of possibility. He is simultaneously the most dangerous and the most helpless, the oldest and the youngest, the most knowing and the most limited, the one who created everything and who still cannot use the toilet properly. He is a contradiction at the center of the show's mythology, and the show loves him too much to ever fully resolve what he is. Section 5. The Eternal War Between Peter Griffin and an Immortal Chicken. There is a fight that has been happening in the background of Family Guy for as long as the show has existed. It is not the central conflict of any season. It is not tied to the main emotional arcs of the characters. It does not drive the mythology forward in any structural sense. And yet it may be the single most defining visual sequence in the show's entire history. A sequence that has been repeated and expanded and celebrated across 2.5 decades, and whose fundamental premise has never once been explained to the audience's satisfaction. Peter Griffin fights a giant chicken named Ernie. That is the whole premise. Peter Griffin, the overweight, middle-aged, blue-collar father of 3, engages in epic, catastrophically destructive, seemingly lethal combat with an anthropomorphic chicken roughly his own size named Ernie. These fights are not brief. They are not played for quick laughs. They are long, extended, elaborately choreographed sequences that take the two combatants through the entirety of whatever environment they happen to be in, generally destroying everything in their path, causing significant collateral damage to bystanders and property alike, and ending with Peter apparently victorious while Ernie lies apparently dead, only to open one eye the moment Peter walks away, establishing that he will survive to fight again. The feud began as the show establishes in a flashback during the episode Da Boom, because Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. That is the complete and total origin story. Peter tried to use a coupon that turned out to have passed its expiration date, and in Peter's mind, this constituted an offense serious enough to warrant immediate physical retaliation. The fight that followed was apparently so significant that it established a permanent enmity between the two of them. Every subsequent fight traces its roots back to that original incident. This origin story is designed to be absurd. The comedy is entirely predicated on the monstrous disproportion between the initial cause and the ongoing consequences. A bad coupon should not result in two beings engaging in a years-long feud that has left dozens of bystanders injured and entire city blocks destroyed. The joke is that Peter's response to an expired coupon was extreme beyond any rational measure, and that Ernie's willingness to continue the fight equally beyond any rational measure makes him a perfect mirror for Peter's own disproportionate aggression. But the show complicates this clean reading in a small but significant way. In the episode Meet the Quagmires, which involves time travel back to the 1980s, Peter accidentally punches Ernie at a dance. This takes place before the coupon incident, which means the animosity between them has a cause that predates its established cause. In the original timeline, Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon and Peter attacked him. But in the altered timeline that Meet the Quagmires creates, Peter punched Ernie first, and the coupon incident may have been Ernie's revenge. The chronology of who wronged whom first is genuinely uncertain. The question of which came first, the punch or the coupon, is a chicken and egg problem in the most literal sense the phrase has ever been applied. Ernie's nature is also a source of genuine mystery. He has survived things that should unambiguously kill him. He has had his head bashed against a photocopier until apparently dead. He has been impaled, set on fire by jet fuel, caught in explosions, had his head chopped by an airplane propeller, drowned, and roasted among other apparent fatalities. Each time the show makes it appear that Ernie has finally, definitively died. And each time the eye opens, the limb twitches, and the audience understands that the fight will happen again. The show once offered an offhand explanation for Ernie's origins that, characteristically, raised more questions than it answered. In the episode New Kidney in Town, Dr. Hartman mentions having once attempted to clone a chicken and accidentally producing instead a hostile, man-sized chicken that escaped from his laboratory. Peter's reaction to this story suggests he knows exactly who Hartman is describing. But if Ernie was created in Hartman's lab, that only deepens the mystery. What were the conditions of the experiment? What made Ernie hostile? What has he been doing in the years between escaping the lab and showing up at the moment when Peter tried to use a bad coupon? There is also the matter of Ernie's personal life. He has a wife, another giant chicken named Nicole. He has a son, a younger giant chicken. One of Ernie's children attends the same preschool as Stewie. He has a social existence, a family, a community within the broader community of the show's world. He is not simply a monster or an antagonist. He is a person with a home and relationships who, when he is not engaged in his periodic apocalyptic battles with Peter, is apparently living a relatively normal life as a large anthropomorphic bird in suburban Rhode Island. In one of the most remarkable developments in the feud's history, Peter and Ernie actually stop fighting long enough to have dinner together. Their battle reaches a point where both of them, battered and exhausted, have forgotten what they are even fighting about. Ernie invites Peter to dinner. Peter accepts. They sit with Nicole and share a meal. The feud appears to be over. And then a new fight begins almost immediately because neither of them can agree on who should pay the bill. The peace lasts perhaps 30 minutes of in-universe time before the war resumes. This detail is, on its surface, another joke about the absurdity of the conflict. But it is also a genuinely interesting character moment. When Peter and Ernie stop fighting long enough to be people together, they are capable of something like warmth. They can have dinner. They can share space without violence. The conflict is not rooted in some fundamental incompatibility of their natures. It is rooted in stubbornness, in the refusal to be the one to back down, in the particular masculine rigidity that does not allow for an exit from a conflict once it has been entered. The moment where they both admit they have forgotten what they are fighting about is quietly devastating in the way that only deeply silly things can be quietly devastating. Most conflicts, when examined from enough distance, reduce to something like an expired coupon. Most long-running enmities, whether between individuals or families or communities or nations, started with something small that nobody fully remembers anymore, and continued because nobody wanted to be the one to admit that the original offense no longer justifies the ongoing war. Peter and Ernie, two beings who have nearly killed each other dozens of times, sit across a dinner table and cannot even remember why they hate each other. And then they start again over a check. The question of whether Ernie is truly immortal or merely extraordinarily difficult to kill is one the show does not answer. There have been episodes that suggested Ernie might actually die at some point, and Seth MacFarlane reportedly considered killing him off permanently in the episode Internal Affairs, but was persuaded to keep him alive for a planned movie that has yet to materialize. So Ernie continues. He opens his eye, he gets up. The fight will happen again. And somewhere in a suburb of Rhode Island, a giant chicken with a wife and a son, and a perfectly ordinary domestic life is waiting. for the next time he crosses paths with a man who once tried to use his coupon and found it had expired. Section 6. Meg Griffin and the Identity. She was never allowed to have let us talk about the girl who might actually be the most interesting person in this entire fictional universe. Meg Griffin is, on the surface, the butt of a joke that ran for approximately 10 seasons. She is the character the show identified early on as the least remarkable member of an otherwise colorful family, and then, as the seasons progressed, made increasingly remarkable in the worst possible way. Where the early show's treatment of Meg was light and somewhat relatable, the portrait of a teenager who just wanted to fit in and was mildly overlooked by her chaotic family, later seasons pushed that dynamic into something considerably darker, treating her as the designated recipient of her family's cruelty in a way that raised genuine questions about what the show was trying to say about this character and whether it knew what it was doing to her. But underneath all of that, there are genuine mysteries about Meg that the show has gestured toward without ever fully committing to an answer. The first and most significant mystery is whether Meg is actually Peter and Lois's biological daughter. This question comes from several directions at once, each one raising a different aspect of the same central uncertainty. Meg was the first Griffin child. She was born before Chris, before Stewie, before any of the family's more outlandish elements had fully established themselves. In the first season, her age and personality placed her in a relatively grounded high school drama. She was ordinary, not in the way she would later be made ordinary as a punchline, but in the way that actual teenagers are ordinary. She had crushes. She wanted friends. She worried about her social standing. She was navigating the universal experience of growing up in a family that was more interested in itself than in her. But across the run of the show, Meg has been shown to have qualities that do not naturally fit the Griffin family profile. She has been revealed to be extraordinarily physically capable when pushed to her limits, having developed genuine fighting skills during a stint in prison that she returned from looking and acting more like a hardened criminal than a teenager. She has shown flashes of real intelligence and competence that the show acknowledges and then immediately moves past. She is at various points a talented musician, a capable writer, and someone who functions considerably better than her family would suggest she should. The theory that Meg might not be Peter's biological daughter has been discussed in fan communities for years. The timing of her birth relative to Peter and Lois's relationship, the fact that she does not share many of her father's most pronounced physical and intellectual characteristics, and the general sense that she exists slightly outside the Griffin family's internal logic all feed into this theory. The show has never confirmed it, but it has also never firmly denied it. There is a more specific mystery about Meg's parentage tied to one of the show's darker revelations. In an episode that explores Lois's past, it is suggested that Lois was not always the stable, responsible maternal figure she presents as. Her background includes a period of rebellion and risk-taking that she has largely suppressed in her adult life. Whether any of that background connects to Meg's conception is something the show drops hints about and then lets drift. What the show does commit to, at least for a significant stretch of its run, is the idea that the Griffin family collectively treats Meg as its sacrificial lamb. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the most explicit engagement with this idea. Meg, having finally reached her limit, delivers a speech to her family that names every cruelty they have collectively and individually visited upon her. She calls out Peter, specifically and accurately, for behavior that would in reality constitute child abuse. She calls out Lois for her passivity. She calls out Chris for his casual cruelty. She is completely correct. Everything she says is verifiable from episodes that have already aired. And then, in one of the show's most controversial choices, Meg takes it all back. She has a conversation with Brian in which she acknowledges that someone in the family has to absorb the collective dysfunction, and that if she stops doing it, the family will simply turn on each other and fall apart. She agrees to return to her role as the designated target. She walks back into the abuse voluntarily. The show frames this as Meg's sacrifice for the family, as a form of love expressed through self abnegation. But the message it sends is genuinely troubling, and the show has never really reckoned with that troublingness. It says that victims of abuse should accept their role to maintain stability. It says that standing up for yourself is selfish. It says that the correct response to mistreatment is to take it for the good of those who are hurting you. Whether the writers intended to communicate this message is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that the episode exists, that it ends the way it ends, and that in the seasons following it, the abuse of Meg continued largely uninterrupted for several more years before eventually moderating as more women joined the writing staff and pushed back against the ongoing cruelty. What no one has fully answered is what Meg's story is actually about. Is she a character whose suffering is meant to be read as commentary on how families treat their least powerful members? Is she a comedic vessel whose pain is designed to be laughed at rather than empathized with? Is she, as some theories suggest, a genuinely dangerous person whose apparent weakness conceals something much more threatening? Several episodes have hinted at the last of these possibilities. Meg, when pushed far enough, does not collapse. She fights back in ways that are disproportionately effective. She has skills and capabilities that should not exist in someone who has been treated as non-threatening her entire life. There is something lurking beneath the surface of Meg Griffin that the show has never fully excavated. The most resonant reading of Meg is that she is the show's hidden protagonist. In a family full of people who dominate every space they enter, she is the one who watches, who absorbs, who survives. The others get their names in the title. Their stories get told. Their arcs get followed, even if imperfectly. Meg is the one who is present for everything and acknowledged for nothing, which is, when you think about it, an experience that a very large number of people recognize from their own lives. The middle child, the overlooked one, the person who is standing in the family photo but whose face nobody quite remembers. The unanswered question at the heart of Meg Griffin is whether all of that suffering means something, whether the show ever intended her pain to add up to anything, whether she is a character with a story arc that has simply been perpetually deferred, or whether the deferral is itself the point. The show's ongoing acknowledgement that some people's stories simply do not get told. There is no clean answer. There may never be one. But Meg Griffin, in her long-suffering resilience, in her flashes of capability, in her complicated and inconsistently explored relationship to the family that does not quite claim her, is one of the most genuinely interesting, unresolved questions in the show's mythology. More interesting, arguably, than any of the time travel or multiverse episodes. Because her mystery is not about the rules of physics, it is about the rules of a family. And those are rules that the show has never quite figured out how to articulate. Section 6.5. Lois Griffin and the woman she almost was. Before we move into the town's geography, there is a character we have been circling around in our discussion of the Griffins without landing squarely on. She is the one who holds the household together, the one who is most often depicted as the reasonable center of an unreasonable family, the one who chose Peter Griffin when her background suggested she had access to a much larger world. She is Lois Griffin. And the unanswered questions about her are, in some ways, the most interesting in the whole show, because they point toward a version of the story that Family Guy almost told but never quite committed to. Lois Pewterschmidt was born into extraordinary wealth. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is depicted throughout the series as one of the most powerful and financially influential people in the show's universe. He has the kind of money that buys yachts and estates and politicians. He has the kind of social position that comes with being old New England money, the sort of family that has been wealthy for generations and has arranged the world around itself accordingly. Lois grew up in that environment. She was raised with access to the best education, the finest social circles, and every advantage that wealth can provide. And then she chose Peter Griffin. The show has never completely explained what Lois was doing when she met Peter. The most established version of their meeting involves Peter working as a janitor at the college Lois attended, which places the initial contact in an environment where the class gap between them was visible and enormous. Peter was not a student. He was a member of the service staff. He was the person who cleaned the floors that Lois walked across on her way to classes. The comic setup of their meeting is inherently about transgression, about a wealthy young woman gravitating towards someone from outside her world. What draws Lois to Peter in the show's telling involves a combination of his persistence, his genuine warmth, and something about him that her carefully arranged life had never given her access to. Peter is unfiltered. He is direct. He is capable of a kind of blunt emotional honesty that the polished social world of the Pewterschmidts never encouraged. There is a version of the story in which Lois's attraction to Peter was an act of genuine rebellion, a choice to claim a life that was entirely her own, rather than a continuation of her family's expectations. But the show also establishes across its run that Lois had a wilder past than her housewife present suggests. There are hints throughout the series of a younger Lois who was considerably less contained. She had a period of experimentation, of risk-taking, of living in ways that her father would have found deeply disappointing. The specifics are sketched rather than fully drawn. There was apparently involvement with rock musicians. There were parties. There was a version of Lois Pewterschmidt who was not at all the person who would end up married to a brewery worker in a modest house in Rhode Island. The question that the show never answers is whether Lois's present life represents what she genuinely wanted or what she settled for. This is a genuinely difficult question because the show has given both readings at different points. There are episodes where Lois is clearly fulfilled in her domestic role, where her connection to Peter and her children is depicted as a genuine source of meaning. And there are other episodes where something darker surfaces, where Lois's frustration with her circumstances comes through in ways that suggest she is carrying something unexpressed. She was a talented musician. She could play piano. She had the kind of refined artistic sensibility that her upbringing cultivated in her. That part of herself has been largely subordinated to the demands of being Mrs. Peter Griffin. Lois has also been depicted, in ways that the show treats as comedy but that are worth sitting with, as someone capable of deception on a scale that Peter cannot match. She is a better liar than her husband. She is capable of strategy and manipulation in ways that the honest, blundering Peter is not. There are episodes where Lois is revealed to have kept secrets, made deals, and maneuvered her way through situations with a sophistication that stands in sharp contrast to her family role as the responsible, transparent voice of reason. The Lois who negotiates with Carter Pewterschmidt is a very different person from the Lois who reminds Peter that he needs to be a better father. Her relationship with her own family of origin is another source of unexplored depth. Carter Pewterschmidt is a character who has been used primarily as a comedic foil, the disapproving father-in-law who can never accept the man his daughter chose. But there is a real story embedded in Carter's consistent rejection of Peter, one that involves what Carter wanted for Lois and what he believes she gave up when she chose her current life. Carter is not simply a snob. He is a father who believes his daughter made a mistake and who has never found a way to either accept her choice or express his concern for her in a form she can receive. Lois's mother, Babs Pewterschmidt, is an equally interesting and equally underexplored figure. The relationship between Lois and her parents contains the full weight of an upper-class family's particular set of expectations and silences. Children in those environments are often given everything except the explicit discussion of emotional needs, and the question of what that upbringing did to Lois, what kinds of needs it left unaddressed, what habits of thought and feeling it installed in her, is something the show has touched at the edges of without ever going fully inside. Lois's most significant unexplored territory is the question of what she wanted to be before she became what she is. Not in the sense of a career she did not pursue, though that is part of it. In the sense of a self she did not fully inhabit. The woman who played piano at a level that suggested genuine artistry. The woman who had the kind of upbringing that opened specific doors in the world of music and culture. The woman who is apparently wild enough in her youth to have stories she does not tell her children. All of those fragments of an alternative Lois are present in the show's lore, distributed across years of episodes, never assembled into a complete picture. What is clear is that Lois chose her life deliberately. She could have lived differently. She could have had the life her father wanted for her, the life her class background had prepared her for. She chose not to. She chose Peter. She chose the modest house. She chose the school concerts and the grocery runs and the years of managing a household that contains, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinary amount of chaos. Whether that choice has been entirely what she hoped for is a question the show keeps returning to and never fully answering. There is something in that question that resonates beyond the fiction. The question of whether the life you chose is the life you wanted, and whether those two things are always the same thing, is one of the most persistent and difficult questions that actual people carry. Lois Griffin has been carrying it for 25 years of episodes, and the show has never given her a clean resolution. It has given her moments of joy and moments of desperation and 1,000 in-between states. It has given her a husband who genuinely loves her, even when he is terrible to her. It has given her children who are complicated in ways she could not have predicted. It has given her a life that is fully, abundantly, chaotically hers. What it has not given her is the answer to whether any of it is what she would have chosen, knowing what she knows now. That answer has been pending for a quarter century. It may still be pending. Close your eyes for a moment if you want. Or let them go soft. Let the words wash over you like something half heard from another room, familiar but not quite fully in focus. Because this section is about the quiet background mysteries of the show, the ones that do not involve cosmic significance, the ones that are just a little odd in the way that your own neighborhood is a little odd when you look at it closely enough. The town where the Griffins live has a geography that defies consistent description. We know it is in Rhode Island. We know it is fictional. We know it has a waterfront, because various episodes have taken characters to the harbor for scenes that require a body of water. We know it has a downtown area with shops and restaurants and a news station. We know it has residential neighborhoods, at least one hospital, at least one elementary school, a high school called James Woods Regional, and a university that Brian attended and came close to graduating from. What we do not know is how all of these things relate to each other in space. The show's geography is entirely driven by narrative convenience. A character needs to be at the hospital? The hospital is wherever the character needs it to be. A character needs to walk downtown from their house? The walk takes as long as the scene requires. A character drives from one part of town to another, and the trip takes no time or enormous time depending entirely on what the episode needs. This is standard for animated shows of this type. The same criticism applies to Springfield in The Simpsons and to countless other animated locales. The geography is not a real place. It is a stage set that rearranges itself between scenes. But what makes the situation in Family Guy particularly interesting is that the show occasionally commits to specific spatial relationships and then immediately violates them. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street has neighboring houses with established identities. Joe lives next door on one side. The lot on the other side has had different configurations at different points in the show. Quagmire's house is nearby, but the exact direction and distance from the Griffins varies. Cleveland's former house across the street has been clearly established in certain episodes as directly visible from the Griffins' front door. But in other episodes, it seems much further away or located in a slightly different direction. The town has also been established as having a loose connection to the real geography of Rhode Island in ways that are occasionally precise and occasionally completely impossible. It is clearly meant to evoke Providence, the capital and largest city in Rhode Island, with some overlay of smaller New England town aesthetics. But the specific landmarks and the scale of the place shift depending on what is being referenced. Sometimes the town feels like a city of hundreds of thousands. Sometimes it feels like a village where everyone knows everyone. The Drunken Clam, Peter's preferred bar, is one of those enduring mysteries of the town's layout. It has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that its location seems to have drifted over the course of the show's run. Characters sometimes appear to walk to it from the Griffin House. Other times, it is clearly a drive away. The building's interior has changed between seasons, though this is easy enough to explain as renovation, especially given how many times it has been demolished. The town's population is similarly unconstrained. There are episodes where the entire community seems to number in the hundreds, where the same faces appear everywhere and the social fabric is extremely tight. There are other episodes where the town contains multitudes, where crowds of strangers fill the background and the show needs to pull from a much larger pool of people than the core cast could represent. The answer to most of these questions is the same answer that applies to most of the town's mysteries. The show is not trying to build a consistent physical place. It is trying to build a consistent feeling. The feeling of a middle-class New England neighborhood where everyone is in each other's business, where the same bars and restaurants serve as the backdrop for decades of small dramas, where the streets are familiar even if their exact configuration shifts. The town works not because its geography is accurate, but because its atmosphere is consistent. You always know you are there, you always feel the specific texture of the place. Even when the layout does not match what you remember from a previous episode. There are also places within the town that exist in a kind of narrative limbo. Businesses that appear in multiple episodes as recurring locations, but have no fixed address and no clear relationship to the rest of the town. The diner where characters occasionally eat. The mall where certain shopping-related plots unfold. The park where characters go for fresh air or confrontations. These places exist in a floating state, ready to appear whenever needed, without being anchored to any particular spot on any particular map. The town's history is also inconsistently maintained. There have been episodes that suggest the town is very old, with a history reaching back to colonial times, and episodes that treat it as a relatively recent settlement. Historical flashbacks have shown various ancestral versions of the Griffins neighborhood at different points in American history, but these flashbacks do not build a coherent picture of how the town developed over time. They are isolated moments, snapshots without a connecting narrative. What the town really is, in the deepest sense, is a place built out of collective memory of suburban American experience. It contains every strip mall and every local bar and every high school football field that has ever existed in the imagination of someone who grew up in a mid-sized American community. It is the town that is every town, assembled from the common language of American suburban life and arranged into something just specific enough to feel particular without ever fully committing to a single real place. This is actually part of why the show has resonated with audiences across different generations and different geographic locations. The town is familiar to people who have never been to Rhode Island because it is not really about Rhode Island. It is about the experience of growing up in a place where everyone knows your business and the same bar has been there forever and your parents went to the same high school you did. The geography shifts because the geography was never the point. The point was the feeling. And in the quiet of wherever you are right now, in the dark, Yeva, with your screen glowing softly, maybe you can feel it. The faint familiarity of a place you have never been, but somehow recognize. That is the show working. That is the architecture doing its job. Section 8. Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. The Friends. With no real story, Peter Griffin has three best friends. Three men who meet regularly at the Drunken Clam, who have been the core of his social world for the entire run of the show, and who have each in their own way been given less backstory and fewer fully explored mysteries than any of the main family members despite appearing in virtually every episode. Glenn Quagmire, Joseph Swanson, and Cleveland Brown are three of the most recognizable supporting characters in the history of animated television. Each of them has a defining trait that the show built their identity around and then elaborated on across decades of episodes. And each of them has a past that the show has teased without fully delivering on. Quagmire is perhaps the most interesting case. He is the show's designated sexual libertine, the character who represents an excessive and often problematic approach to romantic and physical relationships with women. His catchphrase, a single word that he uses as a kind of verbal punctuation when something titillates him, has become one of the most recognizable pieces of Family Guy's verbal landscape. But beneath the surface of the joke character, there are genuine mysteries about who Glenn Quagmire actually is. His real birth name was not Quagmire. The show established that he was born Glenn Quagglechek, a last name that was changed at some point in his family history, most likely when his father, then going by the name Dan Quagmire, decided to adopt the Quagmire surname and gave it to his children. The name change is another detail that the show dropped without explanation. Why Quagmire? What does the name mean in the context of the family's history? These are questions the show planted and walked away from. He has been established as a Navy veteran who served as an ensign and later worked for 6 years as a Navy pilot before transitioning to his current career as a commercial airline pilot. This professional competence is genuinely remarkable when you set it against his personal behavior. Whatever Quagmire does in his private life, he's apparently an extremely capable aviator who has earned the trust required to carry passengers on commercial flights. The gap between his public professional identity and his private personal chaos is one that the show has never examined with any real depth. His stated age is among the most surprising facts the show has committed to. In the episode Foxy Lady, his driver's license reveals that Glenn Quagmire is 61 years old. This disclosure was played as a joke because Quagmire looks and often behaves like someone in his early to mid-30s. He maintains his youthful appearance, he explains at one point, by consuming carrots. The carrot explanation is itself a joke, but it raises a legitimate question. If Quagmire is 61 years old, his history extends back considerably further than the show's narrative has ever explored. He would have been a young man in the 1980s, in his prime during the sexual revolution, a person whose formative years predate the birth of most of the show's viewers. The show makes occasional oblique references to his past, including a briefly mentioned relationship with a woman named Cheryl Teagues in the early 1980s, which apparently represented a genuine emotional connection rather than a casual conquest. This was the one that got away in Quagmire's telling. The relationship that might have changed him had it lasted. the lost love whose memory sits behind all the behavior that followed. His family situation is one of the show's genuinely interesting unexplored territories. His father, a character introduced under the name Dan Quagmire, and later revealed to be a transgender woman who takes the name Ida Davis, was a Vietnam War veteran, a decorated military pilot, and someone who had spent over 60 years living in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. The episode that revealed this, called Quagmire's Dad, was a surprisingly earnest piece of television for a show that typically resists earnestness. The show treated Ida's transition with more care than some critics expected, and Quagmire's process of coming to terms with his father's new identity was depicted as genuine emotional work rather than just comedy fodder. But the long-term implications of that story, how it changed Quagmire's understanding of himself and his family, were never really followed up on. Quagmire also has a daughter. In the episode Quagmire's Baby, he discovers that a woman he was involved with has given birth to his child, a baby girl named Anna Lee. He grapples briefly with what fatherhood might mean for him before ultimately putting Anna Lee up for adoption, a choice the show presents as the responsible option given his lifestyle and self-awareness about his limitations as a potential caregiver. The episode ends with Quagmire watching the car that carries Anna Lee away, and it is, against all odds, a genuinely moving moment. The show has never returned to this storyline. Anna Lee was put up for adoption and has not been mentioned in any significant way since. She exists somewhere in the show's universe as a young woman who shares half her DNA with one of the most recognizable characters on television, and the show has shown no interest in pursuing that thread. Quagmire's animosity toward Brian is also a mystery in the sense that the show has given him a coherent explanation for it, while simultaneously leaving the deeper, emotional roots of that dislike unexplored. His famous speech in the episode Jerome is the New Black, in which he enumerates in devastating detail exactly what is wrong with Brian, is one of the show's most quoted moments. It is also a speech that raises more questions than it answers about Quagmire himself. Because the precision and the passion of his critique of Brian suggests that Quagmire has spent a remarkable amount of time thinking about Brian's failings. The speech is not casual, it is deeply considered. And what drives someone to think that carefully about a person they claim to simply dislike is itself an interesting question. There is a theory, held by a portion of the show's fan base, that Quagmire's hatred of Brian is rooted in a kind of self-recognition. The argument goes that Quagmire, who is himself deeply flawed in his treatment of women and in his self-awareness about those flaws, cannot stand Brian because Brian represents a version of Quagmire's own weaknesses dressed up in intellectual pretension. Quagmire is at least honest about what he is. He does not claim to be a feminist while behaving otherwise. He does not lecture others about morality from a position of hypocrisy. He is what he is, and he knows it. Brian, in Quagmire's reading, is doing the same thing, but refusing to see himself clearly. And that refusal, that insistence on the gap between the person Brian presents as and the person he actually is what makes Quagmire so genuinely angry. The show added an additional layer to this dynamic when Quagmire's father, now Ida Davis, slept with Brian during her transition period in the episode Quagmire's Dad. When Quagmire found out, his rage was, by the show's standards, volcanic. He beat Brian very badly. And while the show played this as a punchline, there is genuine psychological territory in the aftermath that was never examined. Quagmire's relationship with his own father, his father's gender transition, and then his worst enemy sleeping with that same father in the aftermath of the transition forms a genuinely complex constellation of feelings that the show simply does not have the appetite to sit inside for very long. The anger was expressed, the beating happened, and then the ongoing feud between Brian and Quagmire continued as a more low-grade background dynamic rather than being explored for what it might reveal about either character. This theory is compelling, and the show has never directly confirmed or denied it, which means it remains a piece of the Quagmire puzzle that sits unanswered. Joe Swanson's mysteries are of a different kind. Joe was introduced in the first season as the new neighbor everyone admired. He was a police officer, physically imposing, energetic, and utterly confident, despite being a wheelchair user. The episode of his introduction, A Hero Sits Next Door, was built around Peter's jealousy of Joe's popularity, which gives you the original framing of the character. Joe was the man other men wanted to be. He was not defined by his disability. He was defined by everything he did despite it. The question of exactly how Joe was injured has been addressed in the show, but not consistently. Different episodes have offered different explanations for the incident that put him in his chair. In the most frequently referenced version of the story, Joe was injured while chasing a criminal named the Grinch on Christmas Eve, an incident that resulted in his paralysis. But the show has revisited this backstory across different seasons with different details attached, and the version that is canonical in a given episode depends on what that episode needs from Joe's history. The show has played with this inconsistency deliberately at least once, making the multiple versions of Joe's injury a running joke about the malleability of backstory in this universe. What is genuinely unexplored is what Joe was like before the injury. The show gives glimpses of a younger Joe who was physically formidable and deeply invested in his identity as an action-oriented law enforcement officer. He was someone who defined himself through his physical capability, through the ability to chase and catch and confront. The injury did not just change his physical capabilities, it changed his relationship to the identity he had built around those capabilities. And the Joe Swanson of the later seasons is someone who is working through what it means to be himself in circumstances that have permanently altered what he can physically do. His marriage to Bonnie is another unexplored territory. Bonnie was pregnant for an implausibly long time, a running gag that the show addressed by simply acknowledging it as an inconsistency and then eventually resolving it when the writers decided to have her give birth. But the relationship between Joe and Bonnie across the seasons tells a quiet story that the show never fully examined. Bonnie, who was initially depicted as a supportive and devoted spouse, gradually became a character who seemed to resent her life. She had an affair in later seasons. She expressed frustration with Joe, with their marriage, with the limitations of her existence, in a way that suggested her own story had been suppressed by the needs of the narrative for many years. The show brought this discontent to the surface without ever fully exploring what was beneath it. There is a version of Family Guy that takes Joe Swanson's story seriously and follows the emotional arc of a man who was physically extraordinary, was reduced to a different kind of existence by a single violent moment, and has spent the following decades building an identity around that new reality. While his marriage quietly falls apart and his friends, without meaning to, gradually stop seeing him as the figure of admiration he was when they first met him. That story was always there in the show's background. It just never became the foreground. Cleveland Brown is perhaps the most thoroughly unexplored of the three friends, at least within Family Guy itself. He had his own spin-off show, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, and which explored his life after he moved away from the neighborhood with his new wife and her children. That show gave Cleveland considerably more character development and backstory than he ever received in this one. Cleveland's defining quirk within Family Guy is the running gag of his bathtub. Wherever the Griffins are, whatever chaos Peter is creating, Cleveland can be found in his bathtub on the second floor of his house. When Peter's antics destroy Cleveland's house, the bathtub slides out and Cleveland, still in the water, lands in the front yard while saying something to the effect of what the what? This gag was so popular that the show eventually recreated it deliberately, knowing that the audience expected it and was waiting for it. But beyond the gag, there is a question about Cleveland's interior life that the show never committed to answering. Cleveland is the gentlest of Peter's friends. He is the most emotionally expressive, the most openly caring, the one most likely to voice concern or offer comfort in a crisis. He is also the one who suffered the most obvious personal tragedy within the show's narrative, having his marriage to Loretta destroyed after Quagmire had an affair with her, which resulted in Loretta leaving Cleveland and the divorce that eventually led to Cleveland moving away to start fresh. The fact that one of Peter's best friends had an affair with another of Peter's best friend's wife, and that the friendship group survived this, is remarkable and is another thing the show never quite sat with long enough to examine. When Cleveland returned from his spin-off and rejoined the Drunken Clam group, the show treated it as a comfortable restoration of a familiar dynamic. But Cleveland came back as someone who had lived through the events of 4 seasons of his own show, who had built a new family, who had explored an entirely different community and social world. The Cleveland who returned to sit at the bar with Peter and Quagmire and Joe was not quite the same person who left. And the show did not seem especially interested in that gap. The 3 friends together, as a group, represent an interesting, unexplored question about the nature of male friendship in middle age. They have been friends for what appears to be decades. They drink together, they help each other in crises. They sit at the same table at the same bar with the regularity of people who have built their social identity around a shared space and shared company. But the emotional lives of these friendships, the specific histories of how they became as close as they are, and what they actually mean to each other have been sketched rather than drawn. There are moments scattered across the seasons where these friendships are shown to have real depth. Joe crying, Cleveland's quiet warmth, even Quagmire's unexpected loyalty to people he claims only to tolerate. These moments do not define the characters as fully as they should, because the show does not commit to the emotional infrastructure that would make them feel earned. But they suggest that underneath the surface comedy of 4 men at a bar, there is a story about friendship that the show has been circling for 25 years without quite landing in the center of it. The bar itself, the Drunken Clam, deserves its own brief meditation in this context. It is the space where these friendships have been maintained. It is the constant, the reliable geography in a world whose geography is otherwise unreliable. Whatever happens to the clam, whatever disasters befall it, however many times it burns or floods or gets demolished and rebuilt, it is always there when the episode needs it to be. It is the anchor point of this particular corner of the show's universe. And there is something genuinely comforting about that kind of constancy, even when it is fictional. The idea that somewhere there is a bar where the same people gather at the same time and sit in the same seats and have conversations that have been going on for decades, where the drinks are always whatever you need them to be, and the company is always familiar even when it is also infuriating. The Drunken Clam is the most reliable place in the show's universe precisely because it is not a place the show bothers to explain. It simply exists. It persists. It is there. Section 9, the time machine, the multiverse, and what Stewie actually did to reality. Stewie Griffin built a time machine. This is established in the first season of the show, making Stewie the only character in the history of the Griffin household to have invented something that actually works, reliably, in ways that have been demonstrated repeatedly across dozens of episodes. The time machine is real. It functions. It has taken Stewie and Brian to World War II Poland, to the American Revolution, to ancient Rome, to the Big Bang, to the future, to parallel universes, and to the set of the show's own pilot episode. It is one of the most important objects in the show's mythology and also one of the most consequential sources of unresolved narrative questions. Let us start with the basic problem. A time machine in any fictional universe that takes the concept seriously creates the possibility of paradox. If you can travel to the past and change things, then the timeline you came from no longer necessarily exists. If Stewie travels back in time and prevents something from happening, the version of the present that motivated that travel may cease to exist. This is the grandfather paradox, the bootstrap paradox, the well-trodden territory of time travel fiction that every story involving time travel has to decide how to handle. Family Guy handles it in the way Family Guy handles most things, which is to say, inconsistently and with varying degrees of seriousness depending on what the episode needs. Some episodes engage directly with the paradox. The episode Back to the Pilot from season 10 sends Brian and Stewie back to the very first episode of the show, where they interact with their past selves and directly alter events. The consequences of this are played with considerable attention to the logic of causality, including a darkly funny subplot where Brian warns his past self about the September 11th attacks, which creates an alternate future where the warnings cause a different set of catastrophes. The episode acknowledges that changing the past has consequences. It just also acknowledges that those consequences are themselves subject to being changed. Other episodes are much less careful. Time is altered for comedic purposes and then either restored or simply not acknowledged as having been altered. The rules shift. What constitutes a paradox in one episode is simply not treated as one in another. The multiverse provides a convenient escape valve for this inconsistency. If there are infinite parallel universes, as the show established in Road to the Multiverse, then every alteration to the timeline creates a new branch rather than erasing the original. Every version of history continues to exist somewhere. No change is truly permanent because the version of the world that existed before the change still exists in another branch. This is philosophically interesting, but practically it means that nothing Stewie does with his time machine has permanent consequences for the version of the world we are watching. He can go back, he can change things, he can prevent disasters or cause them, and the show retains the ability to simply return to the familiar status quo whenever it wants to. The Time Machine is a storytelling escape hatch that allows any episode to happen without any episode needing to be permanent. The deepest question about the Time Machine is not how it works mechanically, but what its existence implies about the show's cosmology. If Stewie created the universe as established in the Big Bang Theory episode, and if the universe contains a time machine built by Stewie, then Stewie has effectively built a device that can navigate the universe he created. He is moving through his own creation. He is revisiting moments in a history that exists because of him. This is a kind of recursive loop that the show has never fully traced to its logical conclusion. The multiverse remote control, introduced in the Road to the Multiverse episode from Season 8, adds another layer. This device allows its user to navigate not just through time, but through parallel universes, jumping between realities that are similar to the main one but differ in specific ways. The episode uses this device to visit universes where Christianity never existed, where dogs are the dominant species, where everything is rendered in the visual style of a Disney animated feature, where humanity is 1,000 years more technologically advanced, and many others. Each universe is self-consistent. Each one contains a version of the Griffin family adapted to whatever the dominant difference of that universe is. The most significant implication of the multiverse remote is that the version of the Griffin family we follow across the entire series is just one of infinitely many versions. Every choice any character ever made could have gone differently, and somewhere in the infinite space of parallel universes, it did. There is a universe where Brian was never rescued from the street. A universe where Stewie's evil genius phase was never moderated. A universe where Meg's rebellion in Seahorse Seashell Party was the beginning of something that permanently changed Child of the Family dynamic. A universe where Peter never worked at the brewery, where Lois never married Peter, where Stewie created the Big Bang slightly differently, and the resulting history unfolded in ways that produced an entirely different set of people at 31 Spooner Street. The multiverse also creates an interesting problem for the show's relationship with its own canon. The Robot Chicken universe appears in Road to the Multiverse, as does a universe that resembles the visual style of 1980s video games. These references suggest that the show's own universe is one of many, that fictional universes from other shows and other media exist as genuine parallel realities rather than mere references. This would technically mean that every cartoon, every fictional story, every imaginary world is a real place in the context of Family Guy's cosmology. Every cutaway gag is happening somewhere. Every parody is depicting an actual universe that exists in the infinite space of parallel realities. The episode Cutaway Land from the later seasons takes this idea and pushes it further. In this episode, Peter and Lois discover that the cutaways, those brief tangential scenes that have been the show's signature comedy tool from the beginning, are actual places that can be physically visited. The cutaway world is real. The random gags are happening in an actual location that has its own geography and its own internal consistency. This is both a meta joke about the show's format and a genuinely strange piece of cosmology that implies something wild about the nature of the show's universe. If the cutaways are real places, then every time a character says something like, "This reminds me of the time," they are not just telling a joke. They are opening a portal to a genuine reality. They are making contact with a place that exists. The time machine's most emotionally resonant use is in the episode Christmas Guy, where Stewie travels back in time to save Brian's life after Brian was killed by a car in Life of Brian. This is Stewie using his greatest technological achievement in the service of his deepest emotional commitment. He destroys his own time machine earlier in the season because he is tired of the danger it represents. And then he is faced with a situation that makes him desperately wish he still had it. He salvages a return pad from an earlier version of himself at the mall and uses it to go back to the moment before Brian is hit. He saves him. He brings him back. The paradox here is one that the episode does not examine closely. If Brian is saved, then the timeline in which Brian died never happens from Stewie's perspective. But the Stewie who traveled back to save Brian came from a timeline where Brian died. That version of Stewie no longer has a timeline to return to. He has created a new branch where Brian lives, and the branch he came from is simply inaccessible. This means that there is a version of Stewie somewhere in the multiverse who watched Brian die and who successfully saved him, but who can never return to the world where that death happened, because that world no longer exists from his perspective. The show does not sit with this. It restores Brian, celebrates, and moves on. But the emotional weight of what Stewie did, the willingness to sacrifice his own timeline, to potentially strand himself in an altered past for the sake of his friend, is one of the most powerful things any character on the show has ever done. And it sits there quietly in the lore, unexplored, a piece of genuine emotional archaeology waiting for someone to dig it up. Section 10. Death, and the Rules of an Impossible Universe. There is a character on Family Guy who appears occasionally in moments of crisis and who represents something profound about the way the show understands its own universe. His name is Death, and he is not metaphorical. He is a literal entity, a figure in a robe who travels with a scythe, who came to collect Peter Griffin in the first season episode Death is a Bitch, and who has been a recurring presence ever since. The Family Guy version of Death is not a figure of terror. He is, in keeping with the show's overall register, deeply human in his limitations. When he first appears, he twists his ankle badly while chasing Peter, who ran away after falsely declaring himself dead to get out of a hospital bill. Because Death has twisted his ankle, he cannot do his job. And because he cannot do his job, he has to stay with the Griffins while he heals, during which time he bonds with the family in ways that the show plays for both comedy and quiet emotional resonance. Death is lonely. He has teenager troubles. He's doing a job that isolates him completely from the rest of existence. And the brief window of his recovery at the Griffin house is one of the few times he gets to simply be around people without them dying. Think about what it would mean to be Death. To be the entity whose only relationship to every living thing is defined by ending. Every human you ever interact with, you interact with at the worst moment of their existence. Everyone who knows who you are knows you as the last thing they will ever encounter. You are never someone's friend. You are never someone's neighbor. You are never someone's casual acquaintance at a party. You are the door through which everyone exits and nobody returns. The loneliness of that existence, the accumulated weight of being the last face of billions of lives, is something the show touched on briefly and then moved past. But the touch was enough to make Death one of the more unexpectedly sympathetic figures in the show's universe. Death is voiced across the series by two different actors, a change that the show explains in-universe as a kind of casting variation. The first version of Death is voiced by Norm Macdonald, whose particular quality of comedic delivery, that sense of mildly bewildered understatement, suited the character extremely well. Subsequent appearances feature a different voice provided by Adam Carolla. The show has made jokes about this within episodes, occasionally having characters acknowledge the change without explanation. Whether there is a canonical in-universe reason for Death sounding different in later seasons is a question that sits alongside all the other unanswered questions. What is philosophically interesting about Death's presence in the show is what it implies about the nature of the universe. Death is a real entity with a physical body and a specific job. He can be injured. He can be inconvenienced. He can take a sick day, effectively. And when he does, people who are supposed to die do not, because he is not there to collect them. This means that Death in the show's universe is not an abstract force, but a specific operational process that requires a specific agent to carry it out. Mortality is bureaucratic. It requires a functionary, and functionaries can be impeded. The implications cascade in interesting directions. If death can be avoided, then the characters we follow are not merely lucky to still be alive in the plot sense of cartoon characters surviving impossible situations. They are sometimes literally avoiding their fated deaths because death himself is temporarily unable to get to them. Peter's many near-death experiences over the run of the show are not just comedic extremes. They are, in some of them, instances where the machinery of mortality has been briefly jammed. Peter has fallen from great heights, been impaled, been involved in explosions, been attacked by animals, been crushed, and been through dozens of other incidents that should have ended him. The ongoing conversation the show is having with death, not the character, but the concept, is one that runs beneath the humor in ways that reward attention. There is also the question of what happens when death himself dies. The show addressed this at some point in its later run, with the implication that when a death dies, he is reincarnated as a human, and a new death must be found. This addition to the cosmology raises further questions. Does this mean death was once human? Does this mean the current death was chosen from among human souls? Someone who died and was then assigned to the position? If so, what qualities make a person suitable for the role? And what is the experience of a human consciousness taking on the weight of being the mechanism through which all other human consciousnesses conclude? The show did at one point develop a storyline in which Stewie himself auditioned to become the new Reaper. This is exactly the kind of move the show makes when it wants to engage with its own mythology while keeping one foot in comedy. The idea of Stewie Griffin, already the architect of the universe and the builder of a working time machine at age 1, also becoming the literal physical representative of death, is a concept that would have enormous narrative implications. The show used it for comedy and then filed it away rather than pursuing those implications. God is another figure who appears in the show as a literal presence, with a physical form and a specific set of powers and limitations. The show's version of God is equally human in his weaknesses. He is depicted as someone who tries to pick up women with limited success. He is mildly limited in his own omniscience, apparently missing things that are happening in his creation. He is, in one episode, revealed to be mildly autistic, based on his reaction to Peter giving him a head noogie. He is a god who created the universe, but who is also clearly not fully in control of it. The story of how God created the universe in the Family Guy cosmology is, like most things in this universe, simultaneously profound and ridiculous. The show established in the episode Untitled Griffin Family History that the universe was created when a god farted while arm wrestling his roommate Chugs and ignited the resulting gas cloud with a lighter, causing the Big Bang. This is the show's answer to the question that philosophers, authors, and theologians and scientists have wrestled with since the beginning of human consciousness. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because God had a roommate named Chugs and they were messing around and things got out of hand. This sits alongside the competing cosmological claim from the Big Bang Theory episode, which establishes that Stewie caused the Big Bang. Both cannot be true in the same universe, and the show offers no reconciliation. Perhaps the most interesting reading is that both stories are told by characters who were not there, and that both are therefore unreliable. God's version involves a fart and a lighter. Stewie's version involves a time machine and a desperate act of cosmic self-preservation. Neither was witnessed by an independent observer. Both have the quality of myths, of stories that explain an origin through a narrative that says more about the storyteller than about what actually happened. The show's concept of heaven is similarly layered. Heaven exists. It is a physical place that can be visited. Characters who die temporarily have gone there and returned. The infrastructure of heaven in the show's universe is bureaucratic, with paperwork and waiting rooms, and the kind of procedural complexity that the show generally associates with any large organization. God is in heaven, but he is also capable of manifesting on earth, of walking around among humans in ways that are either disguised or simply unrecognized. The God who tries to pick up women at bars is not a cosmic force operating from a distance. He is a being who moves through the same world as everyone else, who is capable of ordinary experiences and ordinary failures. Jesus Christ exists in the show's universe as a distinct being from God, related to him but separate, with his own personality and his own way of engaging with the world. The show has depicted Jesus in various ways across its run, sometimes sympathetically, and sometimes as a vehicle for irreverent comedy. What is consistent is that Jesus is a real, present entity in this universe, rather than a purely historical or theological figure. He has shown up at parties. He has interacted with the Griffin family. He has been depicted with the kind of casual familiarity that suggests the show sees him not as a distant sacred figure, but as someone who is simply around, part of the fabric of a universe where the supernatural is as ordinary as anything else. Hell also exists, and it functions on approximately the same logic as heaven, which is to say, it is a place with its own rules and its own administrative structure and its own personnel. Satan has appeared in the show as a figure who is capable of deals and negotiations, someone who operates within a framework of agreements and obligations rather than simply as a force of chaos or evil. The bureaucratic quality of Hell in the Family Guy universe suggests a universe where even the most extreme poles of moral consequence are governed by something like contract law. What all of this adds up to is a cosmology that is deeply humanistic in its structure. Not humanistic in the sense of being optimistic about humanity, but humanistic in the sense of constructing everything, even the divine and the infernal, according to human patterns. God has roommates and makes mistakes and struggles to connect with others. Death gets hurt and needs time to recover. Heaven has paperwork. Hell has middle management. The universe was created by accident during a moment of relaxed divinity. The entire cosmic apparatus is run by beings who are, in every meaningful sense, just people operating at a different scale. There is a strange comfort in this. A universe run by beings who are fundamentally similar to us is frightening in some ways, because it means there is no perfectly wise authority making sure everything works out fairly. But it is also comforting in the same way that imperfect parents can be comforting to their children. Not because they are capable of protecting you from everything, but because they are recognizable. Because the universe that contains them is a universe that contains beings like you. You are not alone in a cosmos governed by something entirely alien. You are part of a community, even if that community extends all the way up to God and death and the architectural infrastructure of the afterlife. The show made this explicit without meaning to in the episode where Death stayed with the Griffins. He watched television with them. He ate their food. He told Lois about his problems with a girl he liked. And the Griffins, despite everything, treated him with the same mixture of mild exasperation and basic human warmth that they extend to everyone who passes through their home. Death had a bad ankle and needed somewhere to recover. And they let him stay. That is the moral universe of Family Guy at its most generous. A place where even death gets a couch to sleep on and someone to talk to, and where the rules bend enough to accommodate the moment, and where everything, including the machinery of mortality itself, is a little more human than it has any right to be. Section 11. The crossovers and what they mean for everything. Family Guy has crossed over with a remarkable number of other fictional universes, and each of those crossovers introduces questions about the relationship between the world of the show and the broader fictional landscape it inhabits. The most significant crossover, from a canonical standpoint, was with The Simpsons. The episode The Simpsons Guy aired in 2014 and brought the Griffin family to the town of Springfield, where they interacted with the Simpson family, the residents of that town, and the architecture of that show's universe. The episode established, within the fiction, that the world of The Simpsons and the world of Family Guy exist on the same planet, in the same geographic space, reachable by car from one another. Springfield and the town the Griffins live in are not parallel universes. They are neighbors. This has enormous implications that the episode cheerfully refuses to address. If these two towns exist in the same world, then every event from 25 plus years of The Simpsons is part of the same reality that the Griffins inhabit. The elaborate history of Springfield, the rise and fall of the nuclear plant, the adventures of Bart and Homer and Lisa and Marge. All of it happened in the same universe where Stewie built a time machine in a Rhode Island suburb. The cosmologies of two enormously complex shows are officially in the same space, which should produce irreconcilable contradictions on a massive scale. The show deals with this by simply not dealing with it. The crossover happens, it is enjoyable, and then both shows return to their separate identities as though nothing occurred. The Griffins never mention their visit to Springfield again. The Simpsons never reference the Griffins. The crossover exists in its own self-contained space, acknowledged by both shows as a special event but not integrated into the ongoing lore of either. This is the standard approach to crossovers in television, animated or otherwise. The event happens, the connection is made, and then the narrative separation reasserts itself. But the philosophical question of what a crossover means for two shows that have their own internal logics and their own internal cosmologies is one that fan communities have wrestled with for years. For Bahana, the crossover with the show's own sister production, American Dad, is handled differently. American Dad and Family Guy have been established as sharing a universe through multiple smaller connections, the most significant being the Night of the Hurricane crossover event in 2011, which brought together the casts of Family Guy, American Dad, and The Cleveland Show in a three-part story that placed all three shows' locations in the same geographic area, connected by a storm system that affected all of them simultaneously. Stan Smith, Peter Griffin, and Cleveland Brown all appeared in the same physical space by the end of that event, making their shared universe definitively canonical rather than speculative. This matters for the lore of both shows because American Dad operates with a different set of rules. The Smith family has a space alien, Roger, living in their attic. They have a talking fish named Klaus, who used to be a human man. They are connected to the CIA in ways that have exposed them to advanced technology and classified secrets. If these elements exist in the same universe as Family Guy's elements, then the implications multiply. The CIA technology that transferred a human consciousness into a fish body in American Dad is available in the same world where Brian Griffin exists as an inexplicably human dog. The alien technology that Roger represents is in the same universe as Stewie's time machine. The show has also done extended parodies of the Star Wars franchise, beginning with Blue Harvest in 2007, and continuing through It's a Trap in 2010. These parodies are notable because they do not frame themselves purely as cutaway gags or external references. They are presented as elaborate productions that the Griffin family is putting on, with family members cast in different roles. Peter is Han Solo. Lois is Princess Leia. Stewie is Darth Vader. Brian is Chewbacca. And characters from American Dad, including Stan Smith, appear in supporting roles. The Star Wars parodies create their own little pocket universe within the Family Guy universe, one that acknowledges the fictional nature of both the Star Wars stories and the Griffin family's performance of them. But it also does something slightly stranger, which is to establish that within Family Guy's fictional universe, the events of Star Wars are known and recognizable and have achieved the kind of cultural saturation that they have in the real world. Which means Star Wars happened in a galaxy far, far away within the context of the same universe that also contains Death and God and Stewie's time machine. The crossover with Bob's Burgers, a brief moment in The Simpsons Guy where the Belcher family serves food to both the Griffin family and the Simpson family, introduces yet another universe into the mix. The Belchers, who are among the most genuinely warm and functional family units in animated television history, are now technically part of the same universe as the chaotic, supernatural, time-bending world of Family Guy. What all of these crossovers collectively suggest is that the boundaries of the Family Guy universe are extremely porous. The show exists in a space that is connected to a remarkable number of other fictional worlds, some by explicit canonical crossover, and some by the looser connections of shared mythology and creative lineage. The universe of Family Guy is not a sealed container. It is a permeable space that touches and intersects with many other spaces, creating a web of connections that no single map could fully capture. This is fitting for a show that has always been more interested in references and connections than in internal consistency. Family Guy is built on the logic of illusion, on the assumption that any element from pop culture, from real world history, or from the shared imagination of its audience can be brought into the frame and played with. The show's universe is porous because the show's creativity is porous. Everything is available. Everything can be referenced. Every fictional world is, at least momentarily, reachable. The question this leaves unanswered is whether any of it adds up to a coherent, larger picture. If the Family Guy universe contains Springfield and Langley Falls and the Star Wars galaxy and the Marvel and DC universes and Heaven and Hell and Stewie's multiverse, then what exactly is this universe? What are its rules? Where are its edges? The answer probably is that it has no edges. It is a comedy universe, and comedy universes do not need edges. They need flexibility. They need the ability to include whatever is funniest in any given moment, without being constrained by what was funniest in the previous moment. The universe of Family Guy is as large as the joke needs it to be and as small as the feeling requires. It expands to touch every other world when the story demands connection, and it contracts to the quiet street on the quiet night outside the Griffin house when the story demands intimacy. Section 11.5. The show that remembers everything and forgets everything. There's a paradox at the heart of Family Guy's relationship with pop culture and memory that becomes more visible the longer the show runs. The show is famously, almost obsessively, a show about references. Its comedy depends on the audience recognizing what it is gesturing toward. A cutaway works not just because the scenario depicted is funny in isolation, but because the viewer brings their own relationship to whatever is being referenced, and that relationship becomes part of the joke. When the show invokes a specific film, a specific musician, a specific historical moment, it is creating a communion between itself and its audience built on shared memory. This is remarkable in its way. Family Guy is a show built, architecturally, on the assumption that its viewers share a cultural memory with the people who made it. The specific films and television shows and songs and public figures that the show references are not chosen at random. They are chosen because they represent shared landmarks in the cultural landscape of the generation of Americans who grew up roughly when Seth MacFarlane and the show's original writers grew up. When the show makes a reference to a film from 1987, it is counting on the viewer to have the same relationship to that film that the writers had, to have encountered it at roughly the same age and in roughly the same context. The reference is a handshake across time, an acknowledgement of shared experience. But the reference is also, inevitably, a marker of the present moment. Every reference that the show makes carries a timestamp. An episode that references a specific political figure or a specific pop star is an episode that will mean something slightly different to an audience watching it in its original broadcast year, and a different something to an audience watching it 10 or 20 years later. The specific political figure is now historical. The specific pop star may have been forgotten or may have become culturally entrenched in ways nobody could have predicted. The reference that was live and immediate when it aired has become, in some cases, an artifact. This is not a criticism of the show. Every comedy is embedded in its moment. The specific cultural material of any era will fade at different rates and in different ways. But what is interesting about Family Guy specifically is that the show has run long enough that its earlier references and its later references now occupy very different relationships to the present. An audience watching the show for the first time in the late 2020s is watching a show that spans 3 decades of cultural reference points, which means it is also watching a kind of compressed cultural history. The early seasons contain references from the late 1990s and early 2000s, alongside references to older material from the 1970s and 1980s. The later seasons contain references from the 2010s and 2020s, alongside the same layered reference to older material. The show is like a geological record of pop culture, with different strata visible at different depths. This creates a genuinely unusual viewing experience for audiences encountering the show out of sequence or through streaming platforms that have made all of it available simultaneously. A viewer jumping between episodes from different seasons is not experiencing the show chronologically. They are experiencing it as a kind of simultaneous present, where all of the show's humor is available at once, where the references from 2001 sit alongside the references from 2019, and where the question of which ones still land and which ones have become opaque is answered differently by every viewer depending on their own cultural background. The unanswered question here is what the show means to an audience that did not grow up in the same cultural moment as its creators. Every comedy eventually faces this question. The specific things that made people laugh in a given era eventually become historical artifacts that require context rather than recognition. Family Guy, with its extraordinary density of reference, is especially vulnerable to this process. And yet the show continues to find new audiences, continues to generate viewing numbers, continues to feel relevant to people who were not alive when some of its most famous episodes aired. Part of the reason is that the show's emotional core, the family dynamic, the relationships between the characters, the recurring motifs of belonging and rejection, and the persistence of love under difficult circumstances, these are not time-bound in the same way that pop culture references are. Peter and Lois love each other in a way that is legible regardless of whether the viewer knows the 1970s movie being spoofed in again, any given cutaway. Stewie's relationship with Brian communicates something about friendship and attachment that works independent of the specific cultural vocabulary the show uses to dress it up. The show remembers everything in the sense that it compulsively references the entire history of American pop culture. And it forgets everything in the sense that continuity, character growth, and narrative consequence are perpetually reset. These two qualities exist in a peculiar tension, an enormous memory for the outside world, an almost complete amnesia about its own interior. It is the portrait of a person who knows every lyric of every song they ever heard, but cannot remember what they said to their wife yesterday morning. What this paradox ultimately reveals about the show's priorities is that the external world, the shared cultural landscape, has always mattered more to the people making it than the internal consistency of the world they were creating. The show is fundamentally about being in conversation with the audience, about the ongoing back and forth of recognition and surprise. The characters and the continuity are the vehicle for that conversation. The conversation is the point. Whether that constitutes a kind of genius or a kind of limitation depends entirely on what you are looking for. If you want a show that uses its characters to tell a coherent long-form story, Family Guy will frustrate you. If you want a show that is always willing to stop and acknowledge the world you both live in, to say, yes, I know that film too, I know that song, I remember where I was when that happened, then Family Guy is something quite specific and quite valuable. It is a show that insists on the social nature of comedy, on the way that laughter is something shared rather than something generated in isolation. Section 12. The loose threads that may never come undone. By now, the room is probably quieter. The light, if you had any on, is probably dimmer. You have been with these questions for a long time now, moving through them one by one, and maybe some of them have settled into you in a comfortable way, the way that good questions do when you stop trying to answer them and just let them sit there being interesting. There are threads we have not pulled, there are questions we have not asked yet. This is the section for those. The mystery of Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy. Bonnie, Joe's wife, was pregnant for roughly 4 seasons of the show. She became visibly pregnant in what appears to be the second or third season and did not give birth until the 7th season episode, Peter's Daughter. That is, by any calculation, a pregnancy that lasted significantly longer than the human biological standard of 9 months. The show acknowledged this inconsistency at one point by having a character note that she had been pregnant for a very long time, which is a meta acknowledgement rather than an explanation. Whatever was happening with Bonnie's pregnancy, it was not a normal human gestational process. The show characteristically let the inconsistency live as a running joke for years before resolving it. But the resolution, when it came, did not address what had actually been happening. Bonnie gave birth, and the storyline moved on, and nobody asked the obvious question, which is why any human pregnancy would last 2 additional years beyond its expected term. In the real world, such a situation would represent either a medical crisis or a supernatural event. In the show's universe, it was simply something that was happening and then eventually was not. The question of what it meant, whether it reflected something unusual about Bonnie's biology, or the nature of Bonnie's pregnancy, or something else entirely about the rules of the show's universe as they apply to gestation and time, has never been answered. The mystery of where Herbert the old man came from. Herbert, the elderly neighbor who has an unsettling fixation on Chris Griffin and young boys generally, was introduced in the 3rd season episode To Love and Die in Dixie, and has been a recurring presence ever since. He is one of those characters who exists at the edge of the show's moral framework. A figure whose defining characteristic is something deeply disturbing, treated with a kind of uncomfortable comedy that the show has never fully resolved. But beyond the ethical questions about his presence, there are genuine biographical mysteries about Herbert. He is old, very old, older than most of the other adult characters by several generations. He was apparently a soldier at some point, which has been referenced in brief flashbacks that suggest a military service during World War II or the Korean War era. He has a great niece named Sandy who appeared in one episode. He has a dog. He has a house on the same street as the Griffins that he has apparently occupied for decades. He is a veteran. He is a resident of the neighborhood. He has been there as long as anyone can remember. But where did he come from? What is his history? What happened to make him the person he is? There are episodes that hint at a younger Herbert, at experiences that shaped his particular fixations, at a life that was more than what we see. The show has never explored this. Herbert is a figure at the edge of the frame, present and unsettling and entirely unexplained. His past is a closed door that the show has no apparent interest in opening. The question of the multiple versions of the show's internal history is another loose thread. The show has, across its run, told the story of how certain events happened and then retold them differently. The Griffin family history, as depicted in various flashback sequences, does not always cohere. The early episodes of the Griffin family before the show's present day have been rendered differently across different seasons, sometimes with details that contradict what has been established before. Part of this is simply the nature of a show that has been made by many different writing teams across many years. The people writing a season 14 episode may not have complete access to the specific details established in a season 2 episode, or may not feel especially obligated to maintain those details if a better joke is available by altering them. The show has a loose relationship with its own history that mirrors its loose relationship with its geography and its characters' ages. But the effect of this looseness is that the show's past is genuinely uncertain. What actually happened in the early years of the Griffin family before the show began? Which of the various accounts of those years are accurate? There is no authoritative answer because the show itself is not authoritative about its own history. The past of these characters is as mutable as their ages, as subject to revision as the layout of their neighborhood. The question of what Brian's novel is actually about. He has been working on a piece of fiction for most of the show's run, a project he calls Faster Than the Speed of Love at various points. We know it exists. We know it has been worked on, abandoned, returned to, and struggled with across many seasons. We know that Brian considers it his most important creative project, and that he carries a significant amount of self-worth in its eventual completion. But the actual content of the novel, what it is about, what kind of story it tells, what Brian was trying to say with it, are essentially unknown. The show has mocked the novel without revealing it. The few times anyone reads from it or discusses its contents, it is to demonstrate that it is not very good. But we do not know what it is not very good about specifically. This is one of those details that rewards thought. A novel is, in a sense, the thing a writer most wants to say about the world. It is the container for whatever feels most urgent, most personal, most in need of expression. Brian's novel, whatever it contains, represents the thing Brian Griffin most wanted to say, and the show has never told us what that is. The most intimate creative act of the most literary character on the show is a total mystery, visible only through the reactions of people who find it inadequate, never through the work itself. The question of where the town's talking animals come from more broadly. Beyond Brian and Ernie the giant chicken, the show has populated its universe with various other animals who have achieved some level of human capability. The Bears in Cleveland spinoff, the fish, the cat lawyer, various incidental animals in background scenes who demonstrate surprising sentience. There is clearly a broader phenomenon at work in this universe. The mechanism behind it has never been established. Whether it is genetic, technological, supernatural, or simply one of those conditions that the universe maintains without explanation is left entirely open. The question of what Peter's relationship with his stepfather Francis actually meant to him. Francis Griffin was a demanding, religious, sometimes cruel parental figure who died in the 7th season. The episodes surrounding Francis's death were handled with more genuine emotional weight than the show typically brings to these moments. Peter's grief was real and complex. The complication of grieving a father who was difficult to love, who never quite approved, who set standards that felt unreachable was acknowledged. But the full shape of what Francis meant to Peter, how much of Peter's personality was formed in response to Francis's demanding standards, and what was lost when that relationship ended without being fully resolved, is not something the show ever mapped completely. Peter behaves, in many respects, the way someone behaves who grew up in a household where love was conditional on performance and emotional expression was treated as weakness. The pattern of seeking validation through external achievement, of covering emotional vulnerability with bluster and humor, of sometimes acting out destructively rather than engaging with what is actually being felt, these are all behaviors that connect in ways the show gestures at without tracing to the man who raised him. The question of Lois's inner life beyond what we have already discussed is worth noting here too. The most interesting and most unexplored aspect of Lois is what she actually thinks about her marriage and her life in the quiet moments when nobody is asking her to play a role. The show has given us the functional Lois, the maternal Lois, the occasionally desperate Lois, and even the briefly rebellious Lois. What it has not given us is the Lois who sits alone and takes stock and decides how she actually feels about where her life has landed. That Lois, the one with genuine interiority, remains behind a door that the show knocks on occasionally without fully opening. The question of whether the events of the show are real in any sense is the deepest and oldest of the show's fan theories. The idea that the entire series might be happening in someone's head. Various candidates have been proposed for the Imaginer. The most interesting version suggests that the events of the show are being imagined by a different character in each episode, or by a collective consciousness of all the characters simultaneously. The evidence for this theory is impressionistic rather than conclusive, based on the show's general surrealism and the feeling that the world of the Griffins is too loosely governed to be an objective reality. It is the kind of theory that cannot be proven or disproven, which is exactly the kind of theory that is most interesting to sit with in the quiet hours. If the show is happening in someone's imagination, which character's imagination produces a universe in which they themselves are occasionally treated badly? Which consciousness creates a world where their own suffering is real, but the world keeps going anyway? That question points toward a very specific kind of person, someone who is still making sense of their own experience, who is still working out the narrative that explains why things are the way they are. The character who imagines a world where they are sometimes overlooked and sometimes hurt and sometimes treated better than they deserve and sometimes called upon to hold everything together. But we already know who that is, do not we? There is something peaceful about unanswered questions. They are not the same as unsolved problems. Unsolved problems press on you, demand your attention, generate anxiety. Unanswered questions are different. They simply exist. Open and patient, waiting without urgency for someone to sit with them, long enough to feel their particular shape. The mysteries of Family Guy are unanswered questions in this sense. They are not puzzles with missing pieces. They're openings in the fabric of a fictional world, places where the narrative has not yet filled in the background, where the camera has not yet turned to show you what is in the corner of the frame. They invite contemplation without demanding resolution. You could spend a very long time with them. You could lie in the dark and let your mind wander through Stewie's time machine, through the corridors of a town that rearranges itself, through the life of a dog who should not be able to drive a car but does, through the experience of a teenage girl who is made into a punchline and might actually be something much more than that. You could let the questions hold you gently, the way good questions do, without pressing for answers, without needing the show to explain itself, without needing the world to be more resolved than it is. You could just let it all sit there, comfortable and open, in whatever quiet place you have made for yourself tonight. Section 12.5. The supporting cast that deserved. More every ensemble show generates a secondary galaxy of characters who exist in the orbit of the main cast without ever quite achieving the narrative gravity that would pull them into the center. Family Guy has generated an unusually rich secondary galaxy across its run, and many of the characters in that galaxy carry their own unresolved questions. Mort Goldman was the family's pharmacist, a recurring figure defined by a kind of hapless anxiety and a series of personal tragedies that the show treated as comedy. He is Jewish, and the show has engaged with his Jewish identity across many episodes with varying degrees of care and consistency. His wife Muriel was killed in the season 9 premiere, one of the show's genuinely permanent character deaths. His son Neil has been a periodic figure in Meg's storyline, one of the few people who genuinely liked her and wanted to spend time with her, which made him an interesting mirror for her story. But Mort himself, beyond his function as a pharmacist who appears when the plot requires pharmaceutical access, was never developed into a full character. He was a sketch, a type, a cartoon of anxiety. The question of who he actually was underneath the nervous disposition, what his life amounted to beyond the disasters the show visited on him, was never answered. Tom Tucker was the news anchor at the local television station, a character who appeared in virtually every episode as a vehicle for exposition and for jokes about local news as a format. He had a son with an inexplicably unusual face, a child whose appearance was played entirely for comedy, in a way that the show committed to and never explained. He had a competitive and ultimately tragic relationship with Diane Simmons, his co-anchor, who was revealed to be a murderer and was killed at the end of the season 9 premiere. After Diane's permanent removal from the show, Tom was paired with various other characters, without ever being given the kind of storyline that would develop him into something more than a vehicle for news segment jokes. His arc, if he has one, is the arc of a man who survived the loss of his colleague and simply continued presenting the news, which is perhaps the most honest portrait of a certain kind of professional resilience the show has ever accidentally produced. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's physician, is someone the show has both relied on extensively and developed minimally. He appears whenever a medical situation requires a doctor. He provides diagnoses, treatments, and occasionally reveals backstory elements through his own reminiscences. He has been established as not entirely competent, a doctor who makes mistakes, who sometimes causes more problems than he solves, who operates with a cheerful confidence that is at best partially justified. But his own story, who he is outside of the examination room, what his life consists of beyond the parade of Griffin family medical crises, is never examined. And yet Dr. Hartman has one of the most interesting throwaway lines in the show's history. The line in New Kidney in Town, where he mentions having accidentally created a hostile man-sized chicken while attempting to clone a regular chicken in his lab. This line does enormous work. It implies a scientific background that goes far beyond what a general practitioner in a small New England town should have. It connects to the broader mystery of how Ernie the giant chicken came to exist. It suggests that Dr. Hartman has been involved in genetic experimentation that produced at least one creature who has been terrorizing Peter Griffin for 2.5 decades. And it is delivered as a casual aside and never mentioned again. The cast of the high school where the Griffin children spend their adolescence is another area of unexplored depth. Principal Shepard has appeared across many seasons in a role that is roughly equivalent to his counterparts in any high school comedy, a figure of bureaucratic authority who is simultaneously ineffective and imposing. The teachers, the students, the rival families whose children intersect with Meg and Chris, all form a backdrop to the Griffin children's storylines without ever being developed into a full secondary world. Consuela, the Hispanic cleaning woman who appears in various locations throughout the show as a comedic figure whose defining characteristic is her stubborn insistence on procedures, is a character who the show has used as a type rather than a person. She has been in many episodes. She has become one of the show's most recognizable secondary figures. She responds to every request with a version of "No, I have to clean," and the comedy comes from her absolute consistency. She has never been given a backstory, a family, a set of motivations beyond her dedication to cleaning. She exists as a joke, and the show has never felt the need to make her anything else. There is a name for what she is in comedy, a flat character, someone whose single defining trait is so consistent that it forecloses the possibility of development. The question of what she is actually like outside of the moments the show captures is genuinely unknowable because the show has never been curious about it. What all of these characters have in common is that they exist at a specific distance from the main family, close enough to appear regularly, far enough that the show does not feel obligated to develop them. They are the furniture of the show's world rather than the people in it. And yet, given the show's longevity and the cumulative hours that audiences have spent in their presence, they have accumulated a kind of weight that furniture should not carry. They feel known even without being understood. Their specific faces and voices and habits are familiar even without backstory. They have become characters simply through repetition, through the accumulated effect of appearing again and again in the background of a world that has been running for 25 years. The question of what they deserve, whether a show owes its secondary characters the same depth it gives its principals, is one that every long running show must eventually face. Family Guy has mostly answered it by not answering it, by allowing the secondary cast to remain as sketched figures, while the main family receives whatever development the show is willing to commit to. Whether that represents a missed opportunity or an appropriate prioritization depends on what you value in a television show. But there are nights, perhaps, when you watch an episode and one of these background figures says something that lands with unexpected weight, or makes a face that carries more feeling than it needs to, and you wonder for a moment who they really are, what their apartment looks like, whether they have someone to go home to, what they think about when they are not in the frame. Those are the moments when the furniture becomes a person, even briefly, even without resolution. Every long-running show accumulates a secondary population, a group of recurring characters who enter the narrative for a season or two and then drift out again, leaving behind relationships that were never finished and stories that were never closed. Family Guy has this population in abundance. Adam West, the real-world actor who played the original television Batman, voiced a fictionalized version of himself as the mayor of the town across many seasons. This version of Adam West was a deeply eccentric figure, prone to flights of bizarre logic and unusual behavior that the show played for surreal comedy rather than coherent character drama. He died in real life in 2017, and the show honored his passing by retiring the character, naming the town's high school after him, and having other characters acknowledge his death in a way that treated the fictional Adam West and the real Adam West as versions of the same person. The question this raises is what it means for a fictional universe to lose a character to the real-world death of the actor who voiced them. In the case of Adam West, the show chose to honor the connection between the real person and the fictional one, rather than simply recasting or retiring the character without comment. This is not something the show has done for most of its characters, who have had actor changes. It created a unique moment where the boundary between the show's world and the real world was acknowledged in a way that was genuinely touching. Diane Simmons was the co-anchor at the local television news station and a recurring character across many seasons. She was involved in the storyline of the season 9 premiere, which established that certain characters who died in that episode would stay dead. Diane was one of them. Her death was handled as a permanent event, one of the few times the show has committed to removing a character and keeping them gone. Her story, including her relationship with Tom Tucker and her eventual unraveling, was one of the more coherent character arcs in the show's supporting cast. And her permanent death gave the show a brief window of narrative seriousness that it does not always allow itself. Vinny, the dog who briefly replaced Brian after Brian's death in season 12, was a character who appeared for only a few episodes but generated a surprising amount of affection. He was different from Brian in personality and background, warmer and less pretentious, with a rougher social edge and a different relationship to the Griffin family's dynamics. When Brian was restored by Stewie's time travel intervention, Vinny's existence was essentially erased. He never happened. The questions about who he was and what his longer-term relationship with the family might have become are genuinely unanswerable because his existence was retroactively negated. The original New Brian was another temporary replacement dog who appeared even earlier, also erasable from the timeline by narrative reset. The pattern of temporary dog replacements raises interesting questions about how the show understands Brian's role in the family. He has been temporarily replaced twice, and both replacements were ultimately undone. But the fact that replacements were found and that they worked, at least for a little while, suggests that the family's need for a figure like Brian, a grounded, verbal, intellectually engaged presence in the household, is as much about the role as about the specific individual filling it. The children who have passed through the show's orbit are another category of unexplored territory. Over the years, the Griffin children have had friendships and relationships with other young characters who appeared for one or two episodes and were then never mentioned again. Chris had a series of crushes, some of which received extended treatment, and some of which were entirely one-off. Meg had friendships that seemed to be building towards something, and then simply stopped. Stewie's fellow babies, the peer group he sometimes interacts with in daycare and playground settings, are a population of characters who exist in the background of his story without ever being properly introduced. There is also the perpetual question of the Griffin family's extended relatives. Lois has siblings. Peter has a complicated family history. Both of them have ancestors who have appeared in flashback sequences, but the living relatives are a group of people who drift in and out of the narrative without ever being fully integrated. Lois's sister Carol, who married and divorced the show's fictionalized version of Mayor Adam West, was a periodic presence whose own story was never really followed. Lois's brother Patrick, who was revealed to be a serial killer, appeared in a single episode and was then essentially dropped from the narrative. These are relatives with genuine narrative weight. Their stories have hooks, and the hooks were never followed. The question of what happened to all the characters whose stories were interrupted is not one that the show is likely to answer. That is not the kind of show it is. Family Guy is structured around episode-by-episode storytelling, with most plots resolved within the episode itself, and only the broadest character arcs sustained across seasons. The specific fate of a secondary character from a season 12 episode is genuinely unknown. Not because the show is hiding it, but because the show simply moved on and never came back. This is, in its way, another form of the show's dream logic. People appear, interact, matter for a moment, and then dissolve back into the background of the world from which they came. Their stories are not finished. They are simply paused, somewhere off-screen in a fictional Rhode Island suburb, living out their lives in the spaces between episodes. Diane Simmons is in a cemetery. Vinny is in a timeline that no longer exists from the perspective of the main story. Adam West is remembered with a school named after him, and the dozens of others are simply out there somewhere in the loose geography of the town, existing in the gaps of a narrative that has never fully accounted for them. Section 13 and a half, Chris Griffin and the questions nobody thinks to ask. There's a member of the Griffin family who is so consistently overlooked in discussions of the show's mysteries that his very absence from most analyses becomes its own kind of question. He is not the protagonist, he is not the most dramatic figure. He is not the recipient of the show's most concentrated cruelties, or the vehicle for its deepest philosophical puzzles. He is just Chris Griffin, the middle child in age, the son who is neither Meg nor Stewie, the teenager who has been in high school for 25 years without appearing to progress toward graduation. Chris Griffin is 13 years old at the start of the show and has essentially remained in that developmental territory ever since, even as the floating timeline has occasionally acknowledged him aging slightly. He is depicted as slow, not cruel or malicious in his slowness, but genuinely limited in his intellectual processing. Someone who takes things at face value, who does not follow complex arguments easily, who is sometimes described by his own family as not very smart. And yet Chris Griffin, in the episodes that bother to look at him directly, turns out to be considerably more interesting than his position in the family hierarchy suggests. For one thing, Chris is a gifted artist. The show established this early and has occasionally returned to it. He can draw with a skill that goes well beyond what his academic performance would predict. His talent is genuine, intuitive, and unconnected to any formal training. He simply sees things and can render what he sees with unusual precision. This is a remarkable quality that the show treats as a minor detail rather than a defining characteristic, which means there is an entire story about Chris Griffin as a person with genuine artistic gift operating inside a family that barely notices him that the show is never told. Chris also has a bully. Not just any bully, but one of the show's more peculiar recurring figures, a dark entity that apparently lives in his closet. This malevolent presence has been referenced across multiple seasons as a real element of Chris's experience, something the show treats partly as a joke and partly as a genuine feature of his domestic life. The entity in the closet is never fully explained. It is simply there, a dark thing that has been tormenting the Griffin family's more ordinary son without anyone in the household mobilizing to address it. That nobody ever takes the closet entity seriously is itself a kind of comment on how Chris experiences the world. He tells people about the frightening thing in his room, and they do not particularly pay attention. His relationship with his grandfather figure Herbert, the elderly neighbor whose interest in Chris has been a running and deeply uncomfortable element of the show's background, is another unexplored area. Herbert's interest in Chris is played as one of those jokes that the show commits to and then refuses to examine. It has been in the background of the show for many seasons. Chris is aware of it, though his awareness seems limited by his general tendency to take things at face value. The adults around him are also aware of it, or should be, and the fact that this awareness never translates into any protective action, that the show uses Herbert's fixation on Chris as comedy without ever examining what it means for Chris to have someone like that in his peripheral vision through his entire adolescence, is one of those aspects of the show's approach to its characters that does not become more comfortable over time. What Chris needed, and what the show never quite provided for him, was a storyline that treated his specific combination of limited academic ability and genuine creative talent as the interesting and human puzzle it actually is. There are countless people in the real world who are not conventionally intelligent and who are nevertheless gifted in specific ways that do not translate easily into social success or institutional recognition. Chris Griffin is a portrait of such a person, drawn in broad comedic strokes, but pointing towards something real. The questions about who he would become, what he would do with his artistic ability, how he would navigate a world that values the kind of intelligence he does not have, are questions the show has gestured toward without ever committing to an answer. He is, in a sense, the Griffin child who was given the most ordinary fate. Meg's story became one of sustained cruelty and its psychological consequences. Stewie's story became a journey through time and multiple dimensions. Chris's story just continues. He goes to school. He does not do well at school. He draws things. He is occasionally funny. He has a dark entity in his closet. He graduates at some point, presumably, though the show has never actually depicted this. He is still there, still himself, still occupying the middle space of the family's emotional geography, still being the child who is neither the most dramatic case nor the most resolved one. And maybe that is its own kind of answer to an unasked question. Not every member of a family becomes a story. Some people just live quietly and persistently and without particular resolution, in the spaces around the stories that others are having. There's a specific quality that Family Guy has exhibited increasingly as it has gone on, and it is the quality of self-awareness. Characters break the fourth wall with regularity in the later seasons, speaking directly to the audience, acknowledging that they are in a television show, referencing the show's own history and reputation, making jokes at their own expense. The show knows things about itself that it builds jokes from. This self-awareness creates its own category of unanswered questions. When Peter Griffin speaks directly to the camera and acknowledges that the show has been on for too long, or that the quality has declined, or that the writers are running out of ideas, he is doing something unusual. He is acknowledging the conditions of his own existence from within the fiction that creates him. He knows on some level that he is a character on a television program. He knows that the show is in its 20th season. He knows that people argue about whether it was better 20 years ago. What does Peter know about his own nature? What does any character on the show know about theirs? The answer varies depending on the episode and the level of self-reference being deployed. Most episodes treat the characters as simply existing, unaware of their fictional status. But the fourth wall breaks accumulate into a pattern that suggests the characters have a relationship to their own fiction that is more complicated than simple unawareness. Stewie, with his superior intelligence and his awareness of things that other characters cannot access, has come closest to explicitly acknowledging the show's constructed nature. There are moments where he speaks in ways that suggest he understands his own situation more clearly than anyone else. His interactions with other characters sometimes have the quality of someone who knows they are in a story and is navigating accordingly. His knowledge that he created the universe, combined with his apparent understanding that he is also a character in a story about that universe, creates a recursive loop that the show has never followed to its logical endpoint. What does it mean to be the creator of a universe that is also a television show? What is the experience of being both the original cause and the narrative subject? This raises the philosophical question that fictional self-awareness always raises. If a character knows they are fictional, does that change what they are? If Peter Griffin knows he is in a television show, does that make him less of a person within the fiction or more of one? Does the awareness of one's own constructed nature constitute a kind of freedom or a kind of trap? There is a specific kind of comedy that only self-aware characters can do, and Family Guy has been doing it for years. The joke where a character comments on the absurdity of their own situation from within the situation. The joke where the audience and the character share a moment of mutual recognition that what they are watching together is deliberately constructed. The joke where the show winks at you and says, "Yes, I know, we both know." And isn't that itself a little funny? The deepest version of this joke is the one that Family Guy has been making, in one form or another, since at least the sixth or seventh season. The joke that the show itself knows it has gotten worse, that the writers know the later seasons do not match the early ones, that the characters are aware in some half-conscious way that the golden era is behind them. When Peter makes a joke about how the show has been on too long, or when a meta-reference is made to the show's declining ratings or critical standing, something strange is happening. The show is acknowledging its own decline from within the decline. It is watching itself deteriorate and making comedy out of the watching. This is, philosophically, a remarkable position. To be aware of your own mediocrity, to make that awareness the subject of your comedy, to invite the audience to laugh with you at the very quality of what they are watching. It requires a kind of confidence in the audience's affection, a bet that people are still there for the characters and the world, even when the writing is less sharp than it used to be. And the audience, for the most part, has honored that bet. They have stayed. They have kept watching. They have laughed at the jokes about the show's quality and kept coming back for more. What the show knows about itself and will not say, the deeper thing beneath the surface jokes about its own quality, is that it loves its characters. That behind the meta humor and the self deprecation, behind the fourth wall breaks and the ratings jokes, there's a genuine attachment to these people, to this house on this street, to this specific arrangement of personalities and relationships. The show has been maintaining these characters for 25 years. It has watched them be used and misused and flanderized and reset. It has seen them at their best and their worst, and it has kept bringing them back, kept putting them in new situations, kept trying to find whatever is still alive in them. That is not nothing. That is actually a kind of faithfulness that deserves acknowledgement. The show is not the same show it was in 1999. The characters are not the same characters. The comedy is not as sharp and the heart is not as visible. But it is still there, still running, still putting Peter and Lois in the same house and having Stewie build something impossible and letting Brian try to explain himself and waiting for the giant chicken to appear and start something that will not be finished until everything is destroyed. The show knows something about itself that it communicates not through any explicit statement, but through the simple fact of its continuing existence. It knows that the relationship between these characters and the audience is a real thing, something that accumulated over years of watching and laughing and sometimes cringing, something that does not simply evaporate when the quality dips. The show knows that you are still here, and it keeps being here in return. That is the fourth wall that the show most fundamentally breaks. Not the one where Peter looks at the camera. The one where the show keeps running because the audience keeps watching. And both parties know that what is happening between them is something that has no clean ending and no neat resolution and no final answer to any of the questions they have been sitting with together for 25 years. Section 15. A quiet ending for a show that never quite ends. The show is still going. As of the time this script was written, Family Guy has been renewed for multiple additional seasons, with commitments stretching into the late 2020s and toward the show's 30th anniversary. There is no final episode on the horizon, no announced conclusion, no sense that the story of the Griffins is approaching a point of resolution. The show will simply continue until it does not. This means that the unanswered questions we have spent all this time sitting with are not going to be answered. Not most of them. The few that might receive some resolution in future episodes will do so in the characteristic way of this show, through brief revelations that are immediately complicated by new questions, through moments of clarity that are followed by deliberate obfuscation, through the kind of storytelling that gives you a piece of the puzzle and then rearranges all the other pieces before you can fit it in. Section 16. The music, the memory, and the things the show feels without saying. There is one more thing worth exploring before we let the night fully take over, and it is something that does not always make it into the big, analytical conversations about Family Guy, the lore discussions, and the timeline debates, and the character theories. It is something quieter than all of that. Something that sits underneath the jokes and the cutaways and the endless parade of references. And it is the question of what this show is actually trying to make you feel. Because Family Guy, whatever else it is a show that knows how to use music. This is not an accident. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of the show and the voice of at least 4 of its primary characters, is genuinely and deeply in love with the American songbook, with the big band era, with the kind of orchestral pop that peaked sometime in the 1950s and 1960s and has been slowly fading from mainstream culture ever since. And that love shows up constantly in the fabric of the show, often in ways that are easy to overlook because they are wrapped inside a joke or played for irony, but which carry an emotional weight that the joke alone could not carry. The musical numbers in Family Guy are, on their own, a kind of mystery. They're almost always technically excellent. The arrangements are lush, the harmonies are careful, and the performances, particularly from Seth MacFarlane himself as Peter and Stewie, are genuinely good in ways that feel slightly out of place in a cartoon about a bumbling, working class family in Rhode Island. There are episodes where Peter breaks into a full orchestral number with the kind of vocal confidence that belongs in a supper club, not a suburban living room. And the joke is partly about the absurdity of that contrast. But the other part, the part the show never quite acknowledges out loud, is that the music is real. It is not only parody. McFarlane genuinely loves these songs, this sound, this particular warmth that big band and swing and classic pop carry inside them, and that love bleeds through the comedy into something that actually moves people. The question that nobody has ever satisfactorily answered is what the music means with unease within the universe of the show. When Peter Griffin sings, when he breaks into a perfect four-part harmony with a group of strangers, or launches into a fully choreographed number in the middle of an argument with Lois, is that real? Does it happen? Do the other characters experience it? Is it part of the cutaway logic, a side trip outside the main narrative? Or is it something the universe of the show genuinely permits? The answer seems to be both, depending on the episode. Sometimes musical numbers are clearly diegetic, meaning they happen in the story and the characters respond to them. Peter sings something and people clap. Stewie performs a number and the room reacts. These moments are treated as real events within the fiction. Other times, a song unfolds in a way that feels more like a dream sequence or a cutaway, or a moment where the logic of the show's universe has stepped aside to let something more purely expressive take over. The characters do not comment on it afterward. The plot does not acknowledge that it happened. It simply was, and then the show moved on. This is interesting because it is one of the places where Family Guy most clearly reveals its own emotional intelligence. The show is often accused of being purely nihilistic, purely ironic, a program that cares about nothing and is proud of it. And there is some truth to that characterization, particularly in its middle seasons, when the jokes were at their most disconnected and the characters at their most hollow. But the music tells a different story. The music says that the people making this show have genuine feeling about things, that they are not fully protected behind the irony, that somewhere inside the machinery of the comedy, there is something tender and sincere that keeps needing to express itself. Think about the episode where Peter and Lois dance together to a classic song in a moment that comes out of nowhere and serves no plot function at all. Think about the quiet moments Stewie has with his stuffed bear Rupert. Moments that are played entirely straight, without a punchline, that read as genuinely touching if you let them. Think about the episode where Brian, at his most vulnerable, plays the piano alone in a room where nobody is watching, and the camera simply sits with him while he does it. These moments do not answer questions about the show's continuity or its lore, but they answer a different kind of question, which is whether any of this means anything, whether there is feeling underneath the surface, whether the show at its core is capable of something more than the chaos it performs. The answer is clearly yes, and the music is where that answer lives. There is also the question of what Family Guy is actually a memory of. This might sound abstract, but bear with it for a moment because it connects to something real. The show premiered in 1999 during a particular American cultural moment, a moment that was simultaneously the tail end of a long economic boom and the beginning of an era of fragmentation that would accelerate through the following decades. The humor of Family Guy, the way it samples pop culture from the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, the way it treats those references as a shared language between the show and its audience, reflects the specific generational experience of people who grew up with particular television shows and movies and songs. and then found those touchstones becoming nostalgic objects rather than living culture. Peter Griffin is, among other things, a man who processes the world through a filter of pop culture references. When something happens to him, his mind reaches immediately for the movie that matches the situation, the television moment that rhymes with what he is experiencing, the song that captures the feeling. This is presented as a character quirk, often as a joke, but it also describes something genuine about the generation the show is speaking to. For a large segment of viewers, that is actually how experience works. The cultural catalog of childhood becomes the vocabulary through which adult life is interpreted and described. What the show has never quite answered is whether Peter's relationship to pop culture is a gift or a trap. On one hand, it connects him to something larger than his immediate circumstances. On the other hand, it means he often responds to real situations with performances borrowed from somewhere else, with gestures and lines that belong to a character in a movie rather than to himself. There is a layer of emotional inauthenticity built into the way he relates to his own life, and the show occasionally notices this, occasionally lets a moment of genuine feeling break through the cultural surface, and then retreats back into the joke before it can be held. The question of what Peter would be without his references is the question of what any of us would be without the stories we use to understand ourselves. It is a question the show asks without quite asking it, through the architecture of its comedy rather than through any explicit narrative. The same question applies to Brian, who uses literature and intellectual pretension, the way Peter uses pop culture, as a layer between himself and the raw experience of his life. Brian's unfinished novel, the book he has been writing for as long as the show has existed, and which has never been published, never been completed, never been read by any other character in the story, is in some sense the most honest thing about him. The novel is the project that would require him to actually say something true about himself, rather than performing the idea of someone who says true things. And so the novel remains unfinished. It stays in the drawer, is always being worked on and never done. This is also, of course, a joke. But like many of the show's best jokes, it is a joke that contains something real inside it. Something that lands not just as funny, but as recognizable, as the kind of accurate observation about human nature that makes you laugh and then quietly flinch. The music of Family Guy, the memory it carries and activates, the question of what the references mean and what the novel would say if it were ever finished. These are not the kinds of mysteries that get included in lore discussions. They do not involve time machines or biology or inconsistent geography. They are subtler than that. They are the questions that the show asks about itself and about the people who have spent years watching it. The questions about what it means to love a piece of culture, to return to it again and again, to let it be the background noise of your life. What is it that keeps people coming back to Family Guy? It cannot be simply the jokes, because the jokes have been uneven for years, and most long-term viewers will tell you that the show's best days are behind it. It cannot be the lore, exactly, because the lore is full of contradictions, and the show makes no real effort to resolve them. It must be something else. Something about the characters, the world, the feeling of spending time in that particular fictional space with those particular people. Something that is comfortable and familiar in the way that home is comfortable and familiar. Not because it is perfect, but because it is known. That is actually the deepest unanswered question of all. Not who Peter's real father is, or whether Stewie created the universe, or what happened between Quagmire and his lost love. The deepest unanswered question is the one the viewers carry, which is, why does this show matter to us? Why have we given it this much of our time? Why, at midnight or 3 in the morning, when we need something to be the company that helps us sleep, do we reach for this family in this town, Mars, with these questions that never quite get answered? Nobody can fully answer that. But the answer, whatever it is, has something to do with comfort, something to do with recognition, something to do with the way familiar stories become part of the texture of your own life, even when they are about completely fictional people who live in a completely fictional world with no real rules. The town breathes in and out depending on what it needs to be. The characters forget and remember and forget again. The timeline loops and contradicts and refuses to settle. And through all of that, the show persists. The family persists. And the questions persist, warm and open and never quite done. Like the music that plays underneath everything else, like the novel in the drawer, like the light in a kitchen window at a late hour. That is fine. That is actually part of what makes the show interesting to think about over long stretches of time. A show that answered everything would have nothing left to offer on nights like this one. When you are not looking for conclusions, but for company, for something to fill the quiet with, for the comfortable weight of familiar questions. The Griffin family will continue to exist at 31 Spooner Street in a town of uncertain geography in a state that is real, and a fictional universe that is as large as it needs to be. Peter will continue to be a man whose history does not quite add up, who was born in Mexico and raised in New England, and whose father may be an Irishman in a pub in Ireland, who carries inside him all of the contradictory information the show has layered onto him across decades, and who remains, despite all of it, recognizably himself. Brian will continue to be something that does not have a proper category, something that walks between two natures, that drives a car and drinks martinis and loves in ways that dogs are not supposed to be capable of, and that carries within it the questions about what it means to be something for which no word exists. Stewie will continue to be an ancient intelligence wearing a onesie, the first cause dressed up in infant clothing, the most dangerous and the most limited being in the universe, plotting things nobody quite believes he is capable of plotting, because he is still technically required to ride in a stroller. Meg will continue to be the most interesting person nobody fully understands, the one who absorbs what the others produce, the one who knows everything about the family and is known least well by any of them. Lois will continue to be the woman who chose this life over every other life that was available to her, and who will continue to be both completely present in that choice and quietly carrying the question of what it cost. And the giant chicken will continue to be alive, somewhere in a suburb of Rhode Island, nursing whatever injury their last encounter produced. Already healing, already waiting for the next time their paths cross over something trivial and the whole thing begins again. The questions will remain open. They will keep their particular texture and their particular weight. They will sit with you in the dark, not pressing for answers, just being there, being interesting, being the shape of a universe that was built not to be resolved, but to be inhabited. And you can inhabit it for as long as you need to. Tonight, in whatever room you are in, with whatever level of darkness you have arranged around yourself, the questions are good company. The characters are good company. The town is good company. The show that never quite ends is good company for the hours of the night when the world is quiet and you are somewhere between awake and dreaming. Think about Stewie in his bedroom, surrounded by the machines he built in secret, talking to the bear that cannot respond. Think about Brian at the kitchen counter with his martini, reading a page of the novel he has been writing forever, being his strange, inexplicable, entirely himself self. Think about Peter and Lois asleep upstairs, two people who chose each other with their whole selves and have been working out what that means ever since, through every disaster and every joke and every episode that reset them both back to zero before the credits rolled. Think about the town outside their window, rearranging itself in the dark, laying out whatever geography the next story will need, preparing the familiar stage for another morning that will arrive the same way all the others have, ready for whatever impossible thing comes next. Let it all breathe around you. Let the questions be what they are, Let the night do what the night does. The night is long, and there is nowhere to be, and the show has been running since 1999, and the questions have been there from the beginning, and they will still be there when you wake up. So go ahead and close your eyes if you have not already. Let the world of the Griffins soften and drift. Let the geography of the town become as loose and dreamlike as it actually is. Let the time machine spin in its quiet bedroom. Let the chicken sleep. Let Stewie tend to whatever universe he is managing from inside his infant body. Let Peter and Brian sit at the bar and let the conversation be whatever it needs to be. Let Meg be more than what the camera shows. Let it all be there in the background, warm and strange and never quite finished, the way the best things usually are. Thank you so much for spending this time here tonight. If you are still awake at this point, or if you are drifting between sleep and waking, and these words have become something half heard and half felt, either way, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. That is the whole point of this. Not to answer anything, but to spend the night in the company of questions that are comfortable to be with. If you would like to keep doing this, please subscribe. It is free and it means we get to do this again. This slow walk through the mysteries of shows and worlds that have meant something to us in the dark at whatever hour finds you here. Leave a comment when you wake up or right now if you are still with us. Tell me which question stayed with you. Tell me which unanswered corner of this show's universe keeps pulling at your attention. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is and what the room looks like around you. And we will see you next time.